Good evening and welcome to the 10th meeting of fiscal year 2023 for the Milton Planning Board. I would like to now call the meeting to order, and we will begin with our administrative items. The first being our meeting dates. The next for our calendars is November 10th. And we were discussing not having a meeting the week of Thanksgiving. I think it's a hard time for many people. Obviously, our meeting would be held on Thanksgiving Day, which we cannot do anyway. But also for residents, people traveling, I think doing work during a holiday week is difficult. We may be having something to come before us from Winter Valley. So I don't know if you want to talk about it during your update, Tim, but we will need to have 2 public hearings in December if they do come before us. And I'm thinking that might not be enough time. I just want to make sure that there's enough time for residents. So I was thinking possibly having, doing an extra meeting, maybe the following Tuesday or Wednesday following Thanksgiving, which puts us into the 31st. I don't know if folks are traveling or if you would be available if we did try to have a meeting that day.
So Meredith, if we need 2 meetings, well, first of all, do you mind if I remind you we didn't do the introduction?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we didn't do the introduction. So yes. All right. Why don't we do our introduction and then we'll go on to discuss the dates. If we can begin with introducing ourselves, Cheryl.
Cheryl Tagayas, clerk.
Sean.
Sean Fahey, member.
Maggie.
Maggie Oldfield, member.
Rich.
Rich Beeler, member.
And myself, Meredith Hall, serving as chair. And now our staff, if I could introduce Tim.
Tim Zawinski, Director of Planning and Community Development.
And Julia.
Julia Getman, clerk.
Josh is here too.
And Josh, good. Welcome, Josh. Introduce yourself.
Hi, Josh Lee, Assistant Town Planner.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I can go back to the dates. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I will be traveling out of the country for 3 weeks, the last 2 of December and the 1st of January. So if we need 2 meetings, that it would be preferable for me then to do the week after Thanksgiving and then the first normal December meeting, if that works.
Yes. And I was thinking because at that meeting, maybe on the 31st or whatever date we pick, I think it's always fair for residents to actually be able to sort of process the information that's being presented, do a little study, and then have time to come back and ask questions at 2 following meetings. And we can discuss in December, moving up, possibly that 2nd meeting. So again, it doesn't fall the week of Christmas for folks traveling too. So we may be able to get you into both of those, Cheryl, if we look at when we look at the December dates. So Tim, what do you have? Do you have a, I don't know if there's a preference for you on what date? Maggie, also you have your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll let Maggie go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm not available the week after Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Because the following week is town meeting.
Correct. So it would be the 29th or 30th. You're not available those days.
Possibly I could be the 29th, but I've got work. I've got some work things that some wreath workshops I'm hosting. So I'm not available those nights.
Okay. Yeah, and we don't want to get into town meeting, which would be, so possibly the 29th.
The one thing I would say about the week of town meeting and town meeting itself, looking at what Tim sent, the warrant doesn't have a lot of articles on it. So I'm wondering if that will get done in one night. Something to think about.
Yeah, possibly. All right, why don't Tim, just for the purpose of time, if you have a preference, but maybe you can send out just a sort of a doodle poll or, just an email with preferences of dates. Because I just would like, if Maggie can't, if you could make it, but if you can't, maybe you could watch the presentation and then be able to attend the following meeting. I just don't want it to feel rushed for residents to feel like they can weigh in.
Yep, that's not a problem.
Okay, good. Does that sound good, Tim?
Yeah, yeah. So I'll send a poll out tomorrow morning. I'll see if I can try to maybe do two in one for kind of the first week in December and then maybe the around Christmas dates, but we'll get it sorted out tomorrow.
Perfect, great. Thank you. And next we have the approval of minutes. And my apologies, but I had read all the minutes, but I did not have a chance to review after Cheryl made her edits. So I have not had a chance to look through them, and I don't know if others have as well, but I'm happy to defer these. So if people need more time.
I haven't read them either, Meredith.
Okay. All right, so anyone else? Is it okay if we defer these to our November 10th meeting? Okay, great. And then Tim, so we can go on to you for staff update.
Yeah, thank you. So the reason why we're talking about kind of meeting dates in kind of late November and December is everyone hopefully recalls, I don't recall which town meeting it was recent, where we approved an amendment to the Residence D district zoning that enabled the Winter Valley project. Winter Valley is interested in building a new 36 unit building on their complex. They got zoning for it, and that zoning requires site plan review by the planning board. And so the Winter Valley folks are interested in getting in front of the planning board in November and December, if possible. They are kind of hoping to get their local entitlements in line in time for an early 2023 federal funding round for affordable housing financing. So it's, we talked about this, a bit going into town meeting. I think people understand what the project is, where it is, why they want to do it. But, as with a lot of these things where we go through zoning, the pitch to town meeting is, we're gonna look at these things in detail, during the permitting process. And so, a lot of unanswered questions will hopefully be answered at that time. So I think that everyone, I think everyone agrees that it's a worthy project, and we want to kind of be accommodating and make sure it gets done. So I think, if we can figure out a schedule in December to get, at least a couple public hearings in, we'll see what happens. They may bump up against their deadlines in January if the planning board can't make a decision before then. We'll sort it out then. But so I think we'll try to figure out a good schedule. Make sure that we have a thorough and complete review of the site plan, per the zoning, and we'll see what happens. So they'll be ready. My conversation with Ned Corcoran, who's representing Winter Valley, kind of indicated to me that they would be ready for a, we're probably not going to do it, but if we had a meeting on the 22nd of November, they would have all their materials in time, to be advertised and reviewed and everything. So that week after Thanksgiving would still kind of, fit into their timeline. Cheryl, you have your hand up.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
I was thinking it might be helpful in terms of managing time and expectations at meetings is to work with Ned Corcoran on topics to be discussed. Probably not possible to discuss all topics at one meeting. That's the way, that kind of planning is what we did when the Wolcott Woods application came in, and I think it worked pretty well. So in other words, let's say it's traffic or site design, and another meeting might cover the architectural design and landscape design, something like that. And so people can focus their attentions on those things, because it will be just difficult to cover all the topics in one meeting or in two meetings. And so you won't get in depth in any one topic if you try and discuss all of them at a single meeting. So that's just my suggestion.
No, I think, and I think we can kind of all go back to, the public hearing at the planning board and our kind of our notes from the town meeting discussion, and kind of sort through, what were the hot button issues, at the time, and kind of maybe front burner those. It is a site plan approval. It is technically a zoning compliant project now. We amended the zoning, so this isn't, a special permit process, but I think there are, and we'll, continue to go over this in terms of, what the planning board's discretion is on site plan approval and everything. But I think, tackling it the way that Cheryl, proposes is a good idea. And I think we all kind of have a good indication of what, the primary concerns are, based on the conversation that happened during the zoning process. Another thing, and I sent this around earlier, we don't have any application. I don't have a timeline for an application yet, but it is just something that the building commissioner gave me a heads up on. We are going to get another site plan application for a agricultural use on Robin Street at, I believe 154 is the address.
152.
152, excuse me. The folks that own that property interested in putting in a small farm and a sort of a commercial component to do sales of products that are grown on their site. We've been working with town council on this. As we're all kind of aware, there are it's a little bit of a tricky maze in terms of agricultural uses and what's exempt from zoning and what's not exempt from zoning. But we do have an opinion from town council, to help the planning board navigate this. And, this will be an upcoming site plan approval application, coming in. I had a little sticky note on my desk that I forgot to attach to my laptop when I left the office. So I may be missing things. But I wanted to kind of address a couple things that we talked about at the last meeting, and Maggie reminded me of in a recent message. We talked a little bit about a planning board, planning department kind of social media presence, probably on Facebook. I talked to the town administrator about this, just because he's my boss, and also kind of, we kind of want to make sure that the town's kind of social media kind of stuff goes through kind of one, central channel. And I think his take on the matter was, we would rather the town's social media be kind of, we can feel free to avail ourselves of that for anything we want. And not because of any kind of turf or anything like that, but just we want to make sure that if there are other town departments or boards that have a social media presence, that it is active and consistent and moderated. And so it becomes a question of, okay, what do we want to do with this? And do we have the bandwidth as a staff to kind of keep an eye on it? Because you don't want to just sort of put something out there, every couple of weeks and not keep an eye on it. And all of a sudden you've got, some nuttiness in the comments. So I think what I would recommend is, on the one hand, think about like, okay, what kind of messages do we want to get out there via social media to the town? Can we just use the town's, we've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, and then we've got the sort of the news section on the town website, which goes out to an email list. Or if we do in fact want to have a separate presence, we kind of want to think critically about like, okay, what are we going to post about? How often are we going to do it? How are we going to sort of keep it consistent and make sure that someone is, looking at it every day and responding to comments if they merit response or whatever. So that may be something for a future agenda if the board wants to kind of talk through that. He didn't, kibosh the idea entirely, but I think he just wants us to kind of think critically about what we're actually kind of interested in doing. The other thing is we talked about after the conversation on MBTA communities, and we can talk about this a little bit more, maybe under that agenda item, but we're in the process of putting together a sort of a dedicated page on the planning department website as like a clearinghouse for all of the sort of town related information on MBTA communities. There's not much yet, which is good, but we want to get a jump on it, but we want to make sure it's informative and kind of clear and consistent rather than just kind of throwing links up on the planning department page. So that may be another week or week and a half coming, but we're working on it. And then that'll be anytime we talk about it or produce materials or have any kind of information, it'll be right there, you know, for everyone to take a look at. I don't know if I mentioned it the last time we met, but we did get some additional money from, and now I'm talking about East Milton now. We did get some additional money from the South Shore Chamber of Commerce to supplement our budget for the East Milton zoning RFP. So we got $15,000 from them, which is great, you know, above and beyond the other grants that we've received and the Master Plan Implementation Committee match funding. So it'll be good. We'll have enough money to do a good job on that project. One thing I wanted to mention, as we've been going back and forth with town council on that RFP, we are probably gonna have to have one more conversation together as a group to develop some selection criteria. When you do a solicitation, there's two different ways you can go. You can go strictly low bid, or you can go bid price plus other considerations. If we were going out and procuring pens and pencils or paper towels, you'd go low bid. You don't have to, I mean, maybe you do want to do that, but maybe not. But when it comes to services like this, town council has advised us you want to be able to take other considerations into account. And so what we can do ahead of the next meeting is kind of send some example kind of selection criteria, just questions that we can use to evaluate responses and say, yes, no, maybe, and kind of rank different responses so that we have, you know, a good firm leg to stand on when it comes to making a decision that's not strictly based on price. So I'll, you know, hopefully you agree to put something on the agenda for that. And we can talk about that at the next meeting and then, you know, decide on that, and we'll be off to the races on that one. So that's all I've got for, oh, Cheryl, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cheryl.
So, I'm sorry if I missed this, Tim. Did you say this is something where it goes out for a public advertisement, or this is where you can invite firms to do it? The process?
So I anticipate that this is going to be a contract in excess of $50,000. So you have to do kind of the full central register, advertise in the newspaper. We can obviously spread the word to firms that we know and love, you know, just so that they know that it's out there. But if it was under $50,000, we would have to do, you know, it would be a less rigorous process. We could send out solicitations to 3 kind of competent firms and then kind of make our decision based on that. But this is a little bit more involved. We'll probably have an optional site visit. There'll be, you know, selection criteria. We can talk about this. I don't think we necessarily need to do interviews, but we can maybe talk about if we want to do that. You know, that's something we can certainly, you know, add into the mix. So
the selection, sorry, Tim, just in my experience and reviewing and responding to RFPs, public RFPs, usually the selection criteria is included in the RFP. So is that what you anticipate? Yeah. That would be added to it? Okay.
Yeah, so we don't have that in there right now, and I don't want to make it up. I want you guys to make it up. So that's just to explain like why that's not out there being advertised yet is I want to get, you know, that one last bit of feedback from the board, and then we can get that out on the street after the next meeting.
Okay.
That's excellent. Yeah.
And then just one quickly, Tim, as you might think about it, is maybe you can look at some RFPs that either the town has done or other communities have done. I mean, usually there's some pretty standard criteria, and then there might be how many of these have you done, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so we'll find some good ones, and you know the universe of these criteria is not huge, but I think there is room to kind of pick and choose, you know, which things are important to us, you know, to put in this thing, because you know that's the responses that we're going to get. So that's all I've got for now. If I think of anything else later, I'll chime in.
Tim, one last thing on that.
Yes.
I think it could be that there's a team that's compiled. I think that the RFP should be open as to, it doesn't, all of the scope items don't have to be completed by just a single company, that the company can assemble a team to assist with pieces that they may not have the strength in, because it might open up our pool that way. So another factor to consider.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I mean, particularly because we've got design guidelines in the scope. I mean, there's one element of this project that's kind of a strictly kind of drafting, exercise, and then another one kind of similar to what Dotson and Flinker did for us at Milton Village. And so oftentimes you'll see kind of a design firm and then more of a kind of zoning planning type, firm team up on these things. So we'll make sure that that's clear and allowed in the RFP. We'll do that. And that's all I got.
Okay. And Tim, I know there was a letter that came from some of the abutters on 193 Central. And hopefully there's some communication going between the developer and the neighbors on that. I don't know if you've heard of anything, an update on that.
I don't know if I've gotten anything, but I may have.
Okay.
But I'm not particularly aware of any other conversation,
Okay.
although it doesn't
And
surprise
I
me.
just, if it does come up and if you do speak to Marion again, I just want to remind that part of the special permit approval was that we were to be allowed to approve the final exterior, the shingles, the concrete shingles that they're going to be putting on, and they're moving full speed ahead. And I just want to make sure before they've committed to ordering something that they do follow through with allowing us to have, a sample or just have a, to be able to, take a look at those materials, because it was supposed to be that
Okay, yeah,
we were to sign off on those. So just didn't want to forget about that. And all of a sudden shingles start going up and
yep.
somehow fell through the cracks. So good. All right. Thank you so much. Then we can move on. Next, we will offer citizen speak. If anybody would like to speak this evening, please feel free to raise your hand. And if there's anything later on in the agenda, feel free to raise your hand at that time as well. I am seeing Pete Jackson, I believe. If we can invite him in, thank you.
Good evening. My interest really is in the MBTA zoning. I don't know if I'll get an opportunity to speak other than at Citizen Speak. A lot of times boards just, allow speaking ahead of time, but I'd want to hear the presentation before making any remarks. Will I have an opportunity at that time?
You certainly will, Pete. So either if you would like to speak now or during the conversation at that time as well.
Very good, thank you. I'll wait until I hear what's going on.
Okay, great, thanks so much. Any other hands on like to speak? Okay, seeing none, and again, I will happily offer the opportunity for people to speak when we are discussing the MBTA zoning or anything else that people would like to address. So moving on, we have new business. Discussion of authorized planning board signatories for registry of deeds documents. Tim, if you want to just address the letter that you received, this seems like it's a little bit more of just a housekeeping.
Yeah.
The registry.
Sorry, I got a letter from the Registry of Deeds. Sorry, I'm trying to get something off my screen. A couple weeks ago that basically, and it was included in your materials, and it's a short letter, so I may just go ahead and just read it for everyone's benefit. But it basically says, it's addressed to the chair, and says, please be advised that the Norfolk Registry is seeking to update the records in accordance with Mass General Laws, Chapter 41. I don't know what Chapter 41 says, but it's related to this stuff. Sections 81L and 81X provide that a written statement from the planning board signed by a majority of the board shall be transmitted to the Register of Deeds, naming the current members of the board authorized to sign plans or stating the name of any person so authorized by the board to sign. Currently, the Norfolk Registry of Deeds does not have a written statement listing the planning board members for Milton. Kindly prepare said list and have a majority of the board sign it. So I think this kind of, relates to, I haven't seen this before. It's in Mass General laws, so, it is what it is. But I think what they want is, when they get a plan or a document that has, if it's got all of your signatures on it, great. But if it's got mine, or if it's got just Meredith's or whatever, I think they want to have something above and beyond. Whenever I sign something on your behalf, I will sign it and I'll say, signed by Director of Planning Community Development per the, on behalf of the planning board per vote on, October 27th, 2022, which is good. I think it covers everything, but it also requires the registrar to go look at our minutes to make sure that that's actually true. And that I am actually the planning director and authorized to sign on the board's behalf. So I think, they want to have this on record to know, when they see a signature that it is someone that is authorized to sign. So, the question then becomes, what does the board want to do in terms of, do we want to authorize any individual member to be able to sign if it comes down to it? We don't often have these situations where there's a snowstorm and only Maggie has a Bobcat with gas in it and can get to town hall to sign something. It could happen, or just simply say, all the board members will sign it, or the director of planning, Tim Zawinski, will sign it. I think it's all kind of up for grabs. So, whatever you all decide to do, we'll put it in a letter and fire it off to the registry after you all have a chance to sign it.
Okay, any comments? Sean, you had your hand up?
Tim, I read the letter. I thought the letter was asking for a board member for signature. Did I read it incorrectly?
It says naming the current members of the board authorized to sign plans or stating the name of any person so authorized by the board. So
Okay.
The answer is both. So the letter would say, Meredith Hall is authorized to sign, chair of the planning board, or Tim Zawinski, or it would say Sean Fahey, Cheryl Tagayas, Maggie Oldfield, Rich Beeler, Meredith Hall are all authorized to sign, or just, it's really just so that when they get a plan that has a signature or a set of signatures, they know that it's okay, basically.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Okay, in my 8th year now, and this is the first time I've seen this request, but when we had our meetings in person, the Mylars would be brought to the meetings and we would all sign the Mylars. Since we've been having remote meetings, it seems like it may be difficult to get 5 signatures on these drawings in a timely manner. The fact that they still require Mylars is, requires those signatures. So I think that we would have to be mindful of updating that every year, as after the election, if we have to give all 5 members. And, I think, given the constraints of what I just said, I would be happy to have Tim be designated or 1 member designated, any one of the 5. That doesn't have to be the same person every time. So I don't know if would be acceptable to them, Tim, but anyway, whatever. I just throw those 2 options out for folks.
Yeah, I mean, my take here is that whatever the board wants to do, they'll tell the registry what you want. And the other thing to remember is, when you are voting on an approval or a decision, you still, it's still up to you who signs ultimately. So, if again, it's a situation where it's like, oh, we got to get this thing out the door tomorrow, let's authorize Tim to sign it, and, and you take that vote and that's reflected in the minutes. Or it's, we'll all sign it, or, again, Maggie's the closest, she can sign it, we'll take that vote and that'll be, reflected in the approval, decision. So it's not like, this isn't a thing where it's like, well, now, Tim gets to sign every decision, from now until forever, and we don't have a say. It's always going to be up to you. It's just more for like them to have something on hand that they can, refer to when they see a plan come in.
Well, it does seem that we've been authorizing Tim to sign on our behalf on a consistent basis.
It's much easier that way,
It has.
especially with the remote meetings, so.
Yes.
Tim, if you're not available, are we allowed to have a backup person that we recognize?
Well, and I think that's kind of, and again, I wish I had more experience with this. This is the first time I've seen this type of letter. So I don't really know what the practices, typically are, but it strikes me as being open-ended enough that like you could conceivably say any individual member of the planning board, here are the 5 members plus Tim are authorized to sign. In which case, if I'm out sick, Sean can sign, or Julia can bring it around to everybody, or whatever. So I think it's all fair play at this point, and I think you do want to exercise that flexibility. We don't often use it. I mean, we, like Cheryl said, in the old days, everyone that's there signs it, and recently, either Julia will bring it around to folks, or folks will come by town hall, or I'll just sign it. So I think totally in bounds to kind of give yourselves the flexibility to do whatever you want to do.
How would the members feel if Tim was designated as the primary signer, and in his absence, the chair would be responsible if Tim wasn't available?
No, I think that's a good solution. Meredith is probably even more local than I. And so I do think that's appropriate. More flexibility, the better.
And what Cheryl was saying is, next year, if I'm not chair, we can update that and just send them a note saying the current chair, and just.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think whoever the chair is, would have that duty just to back Tim.
Yep, I think that's great.
Yeah. So, okay, cool. We can, you may want to take a vote on that, but we can write up a letter. I'll send something to you, Meredith, on letterhead, and
Great.
this will, you all need to sign it, so we'll have to figure out how we do that.
Yeah.
But we'll make those arrangements. There's no super long rush on this, so we can kind of talk next week about how to do that.
Perfect. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
So if we can make a motion to appoint Tim and myself. Someone like to make a motion?
I'll make the motion that Tim be the primary signer of documents that are such required, and the secondary signer would be the chair, who presently is Meredith.
I second that.
All right, roll call. Rich?
Can I just ask a question before we take the vote? Tim, do they still need the list of every member of the planning board?
Yeah, I mean, that'll be on the letter by virtue of you all needing to sign it.
Okay.
So they'll know who all the members are, and then the letter will say Meredith can sign, Tim can sign. And then I think it's understood and implicit that, the 5 of you as a body can also sign.
Okay. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Do you know if there would, might be a question at some point, electronic signatures just are becoming a way of, in my business, I know that's acceptable, but.
Yeah.
Are you seeing?
That's a good question. I know, I mean, Select Board does electronic signatures on a lot of stuff. I don't know if they do it on recorded instruments, but that's a good question just generally. So I'll kind of dig into that.
That may be easier for you too. So, okay, great. So finish our roll call. I think we had Rich, Sean?
Yes, I didn't say yes, so yes.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't gotten to everybody. Sean, Cheryl,
Yes.
Maggie,
Yes.
Sean,
Yes.
and myself, yes. Great. Thank you. Next on the agenda, this was something that Cheryl had sent out it sent an email to me, and we had received discussion of the Citizen Planner Training Collaborative training schedule. Everyone probably has gotten this from Julia. This is not anything that's mandatory for any of our members, but what Cheryl was suggesting, and I think would be great too, is if different members could attend different sessions if they were interested, and maybe bring any feedback, following their session to just give any updates or suggestions to our board. I have already signed up for the updating rules and regs, because I think that's been something that's been on our list to look at on November 3rd. I've already put that on my schedule, and I thought they all looked very interesting. And a matter of fact, it was funny, Marita Cronin actually forwarded this as well to me and said, this is something that John had always enjoyed attending these sessions. And so that was great. And I was able to tell her that I've already signed up for at least one of them. So Cheryl, did you want to add something to that?
I did, yes, thank you. I, over the years, have attended a number of these. It used to be before COVID that CPTC, I think that's the acronym, held a Saturday event out at Holy Cross, and these were offered. There was a breakfast speaker, they had breakfast, they had a lunchtime speaker, and then took these courses throughout the day. So in one day, you might get 3 or 4 or 5 of these courses in. But I just would like to say that I have found them all to be very valuable, in serving on this board. Some of what is required of us requires our judgment, but other aspects of it is really related to law. And I think it's really helpful for certain things, particularly like special permits and site plan review, to understand where our boundaries are and what our requirements are by law. There was one, I don't see it on this one, that I really found valuable, was writing defensible decisions, so that making sure that our decisions were based on what we could opine on or make conditions based on. So I just wanted to advocate, and I thought it's way too many courses now, probably for everybody to try and jam in and take them all. So I just made the suggestion that if we all picked 1 or 2 to do, then we can share information and save ourselves from all having, and then also learn from it, because I do think it's important in this role that we have, that we be as informed as possible in our decision making. So that's my advocacy. And I'm not being paid by CPTC.
And Maggie, you had your hand up.
Yep, and I just wanted to say I have attended 2 of them so far. So I have followed Julia's emails, and I have found them to be helpful as well. So I do think it's, easy to log on and listen to it. And it is very helpful. So I do encourage people to do it as well.
So maybe something that we can do is, and Maggie, please invoice us on that, because we have a training budget. If you haven't already done that, I usually sign them, but I don't remember signing them. So we've got budget for all this. So, we'll keep track of everything that kind of everyone has been doing. And maybe like once the season is over, these kind of go through the end of the year, maybe kind of, at the beginning of next year, we can kind of have, an agenda item where we just kind of talk through, what we learned and, just because I think it is a good idea. Over the course of years, maybe you'll get to see all these, but I think it's a good idea to kind of talk through kind of just these general things, just about planning boards in general. So we'll keep an eye on all the ones that folks are taking, and then we can kind of revisit this in a month or 2 and have an agenda item.
That sounds good.
Yeah. Tim, could I ask a quick question? Julia might know the answer to this. Do they keep them recorded in the library? I know the first one I think was on the 20th, which is just last week.
You mean like the Milton Public Library?
No. Do they keep a recorded version of the training that if you missed the meeting that you could go back and
Sean, I think if you, and I might be wrong on this, I think if you register, you may have access to a recording, but they want to make sure that you pay to keep the lights on for them. So, you know, I get that, you know, but
Yeah. I do too.
yeah, but it's, you know, again, we have budget for it. It's why we have that line item in the budget, so you guys can do things like this. So, yeah, if I'm pretty, because other things that I've been to, they have that kind of structure where it's like you have access for like a year to the recording if you want to go back and kind of, you know, refresh yourself.
I'll check it out. Great. Thank you.
Good question. Yeah. Good. All right. And just let Julia know because she will get you signed up. So terrific. And then moving on, the next item we had is there are a few, you know, we've been prioritizing sort of some of the zoning articles, things that we want to be taking action items on. So I wanted to keep them on our list. Again, we have the, you know, the cut and fill tree protection, low impact. And I know, Tim, you send out some information on that, on, you know, what the engineering department's doing and, but that we can, you know, and I think we agreed that Cheryl and Sean would maybe work with Tim on that, just as a small working group. Cheryl, any update?
Thanks. I wanted to see, there's a lot in that report if you dig into the details, and I'm wondering the best way to move forward on it. Tim, did the engineering department plan to take any initiative themselves? Do we think that it's something where a couple of board members can do it? I feel as if on the stormwater side, I'm not qualified to do that. You know, certainly on other pieces of it, I feel like I can say what I think I'd like to see, but to make actual proposals that are engineering in nature, I don't think Sean and I are going to be able to do on our own. So I just wanted to see how we might be able to advance this.
Yeah, so we had a little meeting with the engineering department the other day, and what I asked them to do is kind of, out of all of the different action items, proposals, best practices, kind of what they feel are kind of the highest impact from their perspective. You know, they're the ones that administer the stormwater bylaw, and, you know, they're the ones that, you know, wind up, you know, reviewing a lot of these projects for those impacts. So they're going to take a look through Mira Patel, who's the environmental coordinator, kind of took a first stab at developing, you know, a list of, you know, 5 kind of priority items. And so they're going to be reviewing those. And once we've got that, you know, we'll share that with the board and kind of figure out, okay, which ones are zoning, which ones are regulations, which ones are guidelines that we would need to produce. So that's kind of, they're still working on that right now. You know, all that said, I wanted to share the stuff from the engineering department because I thought it kind of assembled a lot of stuff in one place and kind of pointed it in one direction. But obviously the board, you know, you guys, you're the zoning guys or gals, people, folks. You know, you can absolutely, I mean, I know cut and fill has been a priority for the board for a bit. You know, I thought thinking about it this way was kind of a different way than we had been thinking about it, and maybe a little bit easier to kind of wrap our heads around. But, you know, you can chart a course on this one yourselves also.
So another thing I wanted to add on this is that I was encouraged to see that they would, with low impact design, with rain gardens and other more natural ways of dealing with stormwater, the engineering department was amenable to removing the requirement for vertical curves. I know it's something that's come up on, you know, streets not looking too urban, you know, and even if it's a small street, like we've been asked to give waivers on granite curbs because that's what's the requirement in the rules and regs. And the same thing this is something I think I've been talking about for years, a 50-foot wide roadway, right of way, and how much is paved and how much, and whether you need a sidewalk on 2 sides, and all of those things that we've talked about almost on every application. I'm encouraged to see that they want to work on those. And those are things that I think that, based on my experience on the board, I can, work with them on. They're the ones who need to say, how that ties into state stormwater regs, right? So, that's where there's an overlap that I can see. So maybe Sean and I can go through that. There's very detailed list at the end of that in the appendices that ties back to our rules and regs and our zoning, which was very helpful. I agree, Tim. Very helpful to see where these things are located.
Yeah. And I think one kind of entree into this, and one of those appendices is the Mass Audubon tool, which is really, really very helpful, because it kind of, it tells you, what is the typical practice, what's a good practice, what's the best practice, and then what do we actually do? So you can kind of see how we compare to what kind of the industry standard best practices are. One entree into a lot of this stuff may be very simply kind of looking at the typical cross section, which is at the back of the rules and regulations, which not only has the right-of-way width, the typical pavement width, the location of the utilities, but also, like, what do you do with the tree lawn? What do you do with the utility easements? One thing that Mira kind of touched on a bunch is, they want to see not necessarily even a requirement, but just sort of an explicit ability to use the tree lawn for, rain gardens, green infrastructure. You don't even have to necessarily, you may want to say that you've got to do it, but you don't even have to. You just have to say, like, hey, if you wanted to put some low impact kind of best practices in this area rather than just grass, go nuts. And so that's kind of a way to look at it, of just looking at that typical cross section and kind of seeing where you can kind of make improvements. You all know I'm a stickler for sidewalks on two sides. So maybe that'll be a conversation we have to have, when it comes down to it. But there's trade-offs and there's different priorities, and we can kind of figure things out. But I think that we'll work with the engineering department on kind of figuring out what their priorities are. We actually have some additional kind of bylaw models that I shared the MAPC page, which has a lot of really good kind of real world examples of different regulations and bylaws. The state actually also has a smart growth toolkit with models for natural resource protection zoning, low impact design zoning, and then we've also got the sort of the example of, town of Franklin, which has, guidelines for, which are kind of not zoning, not regulations, but it's sort of a third thing that we can kind of sort of, look at and talk through. So yeah.
Just have one more thing to point out, if I may, before Maggie.
Sure, yep.
When we did the site plan approval for the Milton Woods, the Pulte development. So when DCR reviewed the road, the Woodlot Road, I believe it is, initially the planning board was concerned about such a vertical cut, because there's a big cut when we talk about cut and fill. There's lots of cut and fill that was done for that development, by the way. But the cut for the road, DCR wanted to keep the right-of-way as tight as possible to minimize tree loss, which meant for some pretty steep slopes and new trees that are planted on pretty steep slopes. So I don't think our rules and regs at all deal with topography related to roadway, but it might be something we want to think about. That's just one. Another that we've looked at obviously is Wolcott Woods, as it works its way up the slope, and there's retaining walls and little bridges and so forth. And we did look at materials for those retaining walls and bridges with Wolcott Woods, but our rules and regs don't really address that too much either. So we can look and think about, based on those projects that we've reviewed, I guess, like Meredith, maybe you and I, or if others in the past can remember or are interested in helping us, to see where we have gaps. Not just, gaps in the things that we've been concerned about. Because more that's documented, the easier it is to request it or demand it in our approvals, right? So couple last comments.
Very good. Maggie, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just had two comments. One, I was wondering if these rules and regulations would be able to be applied to already permitted projects instead of just future projects. So I know there are some projects, kind of like my own, that we had to do a pretty extensive drainage system on. We did at the time when we were going through our project, we did recommend rain gardens, and unfortunately, that wasn't accepted back then, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. So we wanted to incorporate rain gardens throughout our site, but it just wasn't kind of common back then. So I was wondering if it's going to be able to apply to past sites. That's my first question. And then also I'm wondering if, if I looked under the landscaping, and as I mentioned last time, I kind of wanted to update our tree protection and preservation regulation, because I saw that the Conservation Commission had updated theirs. So I noticed in this, they actually then had different specifications. So I think it might be helpful to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. So I'm kind of wondering if this document is still a work in progress. And I always sort of was thinking that I don't know if it's necessarily a correct way to think that we actually put a height limit on our trees and shrubs. I always thought it should be a percentage. So if you're building a 35-foot building or a project, maybe the requirement should be a tree should be like 50% of the height. So the larger the building it is, then the larger plant material you get to kind of minimize the impacts of that. And if you're building, or renovating a smaller, 20-foot house or project, then maybe the tree doesn't have to be 15 or 20 feet in height, because it doesn't have to be disguised. So I don't know if that's more confusing to do a percentage wise, or it's easier to do like a foot by foot.
Just to address the second question, I mean, it's all up for grabs. We have some tree, I mean, and Maggie, you saw this, she asked specifically for kind of what our tree regulations are. And, we've got some stuff in the rules and regs, we've got some stuff in the cut and fill bylaw, but we don't have very much explicit tree, either protection or planting regulations or bylaws. So I think it's pun intended, fertile ground, for different regulatory schemes. So we can really kind of figure out exactly what works. Again, there's a lot of best practices out there. The Division of Conservation Services, Forestry Division has all sorts of resources and advice on kind of urban and suburban tree canopy. So, there's definitely a lot out there for that. And I think there's definitely room for growth in this sector. And then Maggie, to your first question, I mean, typically, if we change a regulation, you don't sort of do like an ex post facto kind of enforcement on previously approved projects. That being said, if there is a desire on the part of a permit holder to take advantage of new regulations that they think may be favorable to their project, they can certainly apply for an amendment to sort of do things that may not have been either required or allowed in the past, but are now allowed. So it wouldn't be an automatic situation where we would go and look at every single project and be like, oh, there. It would have to be more proactive on the part of the permit holder.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you. So we'll look forward to, hearing more about that. And I just wanted to add in, I brought up at another meeting that a lot of other towns, have penalties about taking trees down on public ways that have a significant cost, and that, Milton really isn't very clear right now on specific, but that we maybe up the ante on that and really make it a notable a fee that somebody would have to pay for just taking down trees on town
Yeah,
property.
I don't know if everyone is in the same Twitter circles as I am, but the developer in Somerville chopped down a bunch of trees in the public right-of-way a couple months ago. And it was just one of these things. I think people have noted that Somerville has a really robust tree bylaw. And these guys kind of flouted it. And it was just like everyone's jaw hit the floor. But those guys are getting hit real bad because Somerville, they don't have a ton of trees, so they really need to protect the ones they've got. So there's a lot of good examples out there. Cambridge is doing a lot of work here, and obviously there's a lot of communities that are similar to Milton. So we can definitely find some good stuff.
Great, thank you. The next, and I had asked Tim to put this on. I had actually been approached by a resident of Milton and had wanted to put it on our agenda, and it now sounds like the select board are looking to do an article on residential outdoor lighting. There have been some issues in town, and many more could be expected. I think with people who want to put a sport court in, or do something that you have light that is and at Turner's Pond currently there's a property that basically has spotlights that are pointing out towards Turner's Pond. And so this is a way just to sort of be able to deal with that. And Tim, you might know a little bit more about, I think it was sent back just for a little bit more tweaking. It was expected to go on to the December warrant for the town meeting, but I think I don't know if it will be quite ready for that. But I thought if we could see that, I would not be opposed, or I would actually like to support that article if our board felt once we see it that would be something we would like to support.
Yeah, so Aaron Bradley on the select board had drafted up an article, relative to outdoor residential lighting, and the I'm just bringing it up on my computer just to see what it is. Town council had kind of kicked it back and basically said, if folks, Cheryl might be the only one, although maybe people are town meeting members, they were paying attention. Way back when we tried to do a noise bylaw in the general bylaws, and for a similar reason, because it was related to buildings and kind of land use, that town council kind of decided or advised us that it would be better in zoning rather than the general bylaws. And so that's where this article stands now. It's not on the special town meeting warrant for December as a general bylaw change. If it is going to be considered, it should be in the zoning bylaws. So I haven't had a chance to review this very closely, but I think, again, the planning board has done a lot of work in this area, in site plan review and special permits in terms of requiring, compliance with the Dark Sky Foundation's, guidelines on outdoor lighting, shielding, pointing it where it needs to point, different levels of illumination. So I think, there's a lot that we can pull from our own work. There's a lot that we can pull from, obviously, Aaron Bradley has done a little bit of work on this. And again, this is something that, a lot of towns are concerned with. And so there's a lot of good examples of this type of thing. So I think, it's a combination of kind of responding to the specific local concern. I'm not here at night, so I haven't seen this Turner's Pond light, although I've heard from multiple parties about it. But I think this has been something that's been floating around for a while. And I think, if there's momentum to act on it, then it might be something that is worth the planning board taking a look at.
Great, thank you. Cheryl, you had your hand up next.
I would support that we take a position, and I'm wondering if it becomes a zoning article, was the intent for it to come through the planning board, or basically for the select board to submit it and then the planning board to hold a hearing? And then my second question would be, is it possible to get, I understand there may be a special March town meeting. And is that the goal? Would that be the timing that they were looking for?
I would want to talk to Erin, specifically what her kind of, goal would be. I think, originally when Meredith had seen this and we talked about it, Meredith, I don't want to speak for you, but it's like, oh, this is a good idea. Let's see if the planning board can support it. And I think it is now, as a zoning article, it'll have to go through the planning board for a public hearing one way or the other. And so then it just becomes a question of, does the select board want to drive the bus and kind of be the sort of proponent of it and just bring it over? Does the planning board want to pick it up and run with it? That's something that maybe we can kind of discuss with the select board, specifically. And then in terms of timeline, again, that's something that's maybe up for grabs. We'll have to look at kind of what's on, if there is, a March town meeting, then we look at the annual and see what else is on the docket. So we can also talk about that with them and what their expectations are.
Yeah, it sounded like it was going to be it would be ready for March. But, depending on if the select board wanted to send it to us, in advance, I'm happy for them to run with it. I think they're, Erin's done a lot of work on it and working with Kevin Freitag now and just a few details. But I just, would be happy to, if they would like for us to support it, that we would do so. Okay, and I think Sean, Maggie, and then Rich had his hand up. So Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. My question, it might be a little preliminary, but maybe it's already in there. I glanced through what was written. Who is the enforcement agent proposed?
It would be Joe Prondak.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, and I have to give a little bit of, I skimmed it, so I kind of know generally what's in there. But it's kind of, the two different kind of components of, at the building permit application level, sort of making sure that all the lighting is compliant with, with the zoning, just like we would do with height and setback regulations. And then a kind of on an ongoing operational basis, the zoning enforcement officer is the one that if, your spotlight is shining into your neighbor's house, you give him a call. That's obviously always a concern that Joe has, the bandwidth of his staff to be able to enforce these things. So, we'll definitely want to kind of be in close touch with him about kind of, I think, in many cases, design is self-enforcing. And if we can catch things, at the sort of application level and make sure that they're functioning the way they're supposed to function, then enforcement becomes less of an issue. But we'll definitely want to work hand in glove with him to make sure that everything is, how it needs to be in order to have it be effective bylaw.
Yeah, that was my reason for asking. They have an amount of bandwidth, and it seems like the tasks grow and grow and grow. But I do think this, Tim, what you just described is the best mechanism for limiting how much they have to enforce if we catch it during design. There's a residence that I pass by frequently at night that, in my opinion, is tremendously overlit. But anyhow, I'll stop talking and pass it along to whoever's next.
Maggie and then Rich.
So I probably have a slightly different view because I think I've been a poster child for this lighting for these years. And I do think it's awfully challenging for the building department to follow up. So my business is regulated by with outdoor lighting, and granted we're not, we're commercial, but it is, Joe Prondak doesn't like following up on these things. And basically what happens is if someone has a complaint, they take a picture of it and then they forward it to Joe, and then he follows up and then he just says, could you make sure that it's turned off? And we're very good here at the nursery following this, but sometimes, when I leave the nursery here at 10 o'clock at night, after one of our meetings, I might not turn off my light. So I'm usually not a fan of over-regulation. And to me, this also feels a little bit like what came before town meeting a couple of years ago about the trash cans, having a bylaw to make people put their trash cans away in a timely manner. And I know that this one particular household is really the house that's driving this. But I think we all try to be good neighbors. And I just hope this doesn't really take away from neighbor collaboration. And I just hope it doesn't cause more problems than it solves. I'm not saying I'm against it, but I just,
No, absolutely.
I'm just cautious. I'm just a little bit cautious.
Yeah. And thanks, Maggie. That's, yeah. And Rich, your hand is up.
Yep. I was just going to say simply that, yeah, no, I'm a proponent of us working on that. When that comes around, it sounds like, I mean, we definitely would work on it, but would we be leading it or select board? I don't think I have an opinion on that, but obviously would be a big part of it anyway. Question, Tim, it sounds like this is very much residential. There's probably bylaws about, not looking at them, but about commercial. Does anything in the commercial lighting need to be updated at the same time? Would it make sense to do them both at the same time? Or is this just a look at the residential piece?
Good question, Rich. My instinct here is that if we're going to talk lighting, let's talk lighting. So, you know, this is, and so it becomes the kind of thing of, you know, as a sort of a general bylaw proposal, this didn't come before the planning board in any kind of regard, you know, which is, you know, we amend the general bylaws all the time, but I think the fact that, you know, it was advised to go through zoning is an opportunity for, you know, folks who, you know, like it or not, you all probably know more about kind of this type of exterior lighting than a lot of people, just by virtue of having to talk about this stuff on all these different applications. And so I think it is a good opportunity to kind of take a look at what the text is. You know, is it addressing what, you know, you see as the common, you know, issues when it comes to development? I think, you know, to Maggie's point, and you know, I kind of tried to address it earlier, you know, the more that you can kind of regulate, you know, what actually gets built on the thing rather than, you know, how bright someone's bulb is, you know, that's something that becomes, you know, a little bit harder to go through if, you know, you call the code enforcement officer at midnight because the light's shining in your window, you're not going to get much relief. But you know, if you do require lights to be kind of constructed and designed in a certain way to kind of kibosh the problem in the first place, I think that's kind of a direction that, you know, I think the board kind of is more comfortable with. So I think there's an opportunity here to look at what the text that we've got and kind of what we have observed as other issues relative to lighting and kind of, you know, fold them in. So I think, you know, my advice would be to like look comprehensively, and if it becomes too much of a big deal, then like let's do the one and then we can do the other. But you know, start big and then, you know, get small if you need to.
Yeah, I like that. Like I agree with all that. Just to add on to one piece about the regulation part of, you know, being tough. The other part of this though is it helps, I think, folks, right? So I've got a basketball court-ish in my backyard, and I did put a light on, you know, low on the side of my house, but I've been in lighting for years, and it was tough for even me to figure out what type of light to put there. And I think I did a good job, but quite honestly, it's not easy to figure out what you should put there. You got to be a designer pretty much, and so having something for people to look at could actually help folks choose the right thing.
That's great, Rich. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing here to Rich's point? I think some guidelines could be developed, you know, how many lumens, what kind of temperature, you know, LED lights are common, but maybe some people not all people are using those kind of fixtures, but they also come in different color temperatures. Yeah. And so those things can all be a factor. And glare, LEDs can have a lot of glare, and that's why there's the cutoffs and there's diffusing elements to them. So, you know, it might be worth having, doing a little research into what the field, the lighting design field is recommending for an average residential home, I think some people do it for security, around their properties, and some people do it to light outdoor spaces, entrances and so forth. And those are just pretty standard. And so I don't think it should be that difficult we have sign guidelines, we have design review guidelines. Why not have some lighting design guidelines?
Thank you. Sean, is your hand still up from before?
I apologize. I'll lower it.
And I don't know if anybody from the public would like to speak on this particular item or any of the other articles that we've discussed so far. Please feel free to raise your hand if so. And then Tim, if you want to just introduce this, we don't need to, I don't think, spend a lot of time on it, but it's something that I know you had brought up a while back, and I just didn't want it to get lost, is the small cell telecommunication facility design.
Yeah, so back in 2018, the Federal Communications Commission issued I don't know what they call it, but it's a thing that you have to do. And basically it was about ensuring the consistent and reasonable kind of uptake of 5G effectively, and kind of wireless infrastructure in kind of general. The thing about a wireless network is the network doesn't work if it's not a network. I know that sounds self-evident and silly, but anyone that kind of has been out in the woods where there isn't a cell tower kind of understands that in order to have a network, you've got to have the infrastructure to kind of support that network. And so it's in the FCC's kind of interest to make sure that any kind of state and local barriers to the effective deployment of a wireless network are kind of, those hurdles are lowered to the greatest extent possible. And so there's been previous regulations and guidance about what is in the purview of local jurisdictions to regulate and what's not. In the kind of first really wave of kind of wireless infrastructure, which is, the big cell towers that everyone kind of, knows and maybe loves or doesn't love. We put together design standards for that. We have zoning for wireless telecom facilities. We have a wireless telecom design review committee, not super active anymore. We had a kind of a wave of these facilities coming in, as the sort of original cell network was being built out. And now that it's pretty kind of full built out, we don't see as many of those applications. But with new 5G technology, this is a technology that is much smaller in kind of physical scale, but the network needs to be much more. So there's got to be more sort of towers effectively. And I use the term towers. What I really mean is facilities. So in the way that a cell tower can kind of cast a net over a really wide geography, these small cell facilities cast a smaller net over a smaller geography and then need to be kind of chained together. And so just as kind of, the federal government encountered local jurisdictions that maybe, we don't want this stuff in our community, so we're going to zone against it, or we're going to create onerous guidelines, that prevent it from happening. That affects everybody who needs to use that network. And so they have regulations and rules about the timely kind of review and approval of these types of facilities. And so in 2018, this is the most recent, regulations that came down from the FCC. And it was related to basically the amount of time, they call it a shot clock, if you're familiar with basketball. It's a 24, you have to shoot before 24 seconds rolls out. So you've got to make a decision on a small cell facility within 60 days if it's on an existing utility pole, or 90 days if it requires new infrastructure. So in response to all of this, the select board, with the guidance of town council, put together a small cell policy that basically, lays out a procedure for the review of these facilities. Like I said, we're not talking about big, huge towers on a hill that need to be kind of camouflaged with pine tree branches or whatever. We're talking about equipment that goes on an existing utility pole. And so The select board has a procedure. I actually just kind of shepherded one through the select board process a couple months ago. But we're anticipating that there's going to be more and more of these things. And so we're good on kind of the timing and the scheduling of it. But what I think, folks have been noticing is there's a couple ways to go about this. And on one end of the spectrum is, the utility companies just throw their equipment up on the pole and it looks like, something out of, Mos Eisley Spaceport. You've got all sorts of equipment kind of in wires coming all over the place. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, I don't think anyone would necessarily call them lovely, but at least they're kind of enclosed, a kind of an actual kind of design sensibility to, concealing some of the more aesthetically offensive elements of this equipment and doing something in a way that, isn't just a bunch of electronic equipment on a utility pole. So what I think the select board, after they drafted this policy, what they kind of hoped would happen was, that the planning board would eventually take up zoning that would include, perhaps folding it into the existing telecom design review process, adding in kind of small cell specific requirements, and really, kind of design standards for, how these things should look in our community. And so, relative to that, I sent along the policy that the select board has, which is very detailed and kind of works. But I don't think the select board wants to be in the business of kind of approving this stuff, or at least being the sole arbiters of the look and feel of these things. And then I also sent along, town council recommended looking at town of Hamilton has kind of specific small cell facility zoning that they have, put together in response to that 2018 FCC, rulemaking. So, one thing, and I had this conversation with Meredith, I kind of think that this probably takes the form of amendment to our existing wireless telecom zoning bylaw. I hadn't put a ton of thought into it, and Meredith called me and said, we've got all this, and it's still probably operative. We still do every now and again get a regular cell tower application, but a lot of the concerns and a lot of the issues are the same. It's just the scale is different. And so not necessarily a kind of a huge rush on this. We do have a policy in place so that when we get applications, we know what to do with them. But I think we want to get ahead of this so that we don't get an influx of just kind of junky stuff, up on utility poles, that we actually have, there's only so far you can go. And I can show you examples of what these things look like. You've probably seen them in City of Boston. And if you recognize them, you'll see them everywhere, where there's sort of like a biggish kind of cabinet at the ground level and then a kind of wider kind of cylinder at the top of a pole. They look the way they look, but at least it's not kind of, again, junky stuff on the top of a telephone pole. So again, don't have to talk about it too much now. I want to do a little bit more reading into what other towns are doing and maybe, how we can elegantly amend our existing bylaw so that there's not as much kind of, new material, just kind of really targeted. But, anyone that's interested in kind of, looking at that some more and providing some more input, happy to hear it. Cheryl, you've had your hand up, sorry.
No problem. I just want to mention that I've seen them where that base is really large and it takes up a good chunk of the sidewalk. And I don't know if there's any variable in the equipment and in the size of those bases, but we have narrow sidewalks for the most part in Milton. And I can see those things taking up the entire sidewalk. And, we have to be mindful of being able to pass on the sidewalk, right? So anyway, that's my one concern, and wanted to make sure that I would like to understand if there's options, for how these are implemented. Is there a smaller scale? Does that mean that they're more frequently spaced? At the larger scale, does that mean they're less frequently spaced? Just to kind of understand how they make their decisions about where to put them, because they can have impact.
Yeah, and I think if you and it's a great point. If you look through, we got an application from Verizon, and I'll be totally honest. A lot of this stuff was soup to me, in terms of the power of the signal that's coming off, and they've got all these different diagrams and tests that they do, and there is kind of thinking that goes behind, and there are requirements behind what is the necessity of putting this here as opposed to other perhaps less impactful locations. The one that we reviewed was on Guile Road, and sort of the question became, what's the proximity to other existing poles? What's the proximity to someone's driveway, to someone's house? So there needs to be a justification for why this location, as opposed to alternative locations. And I think that's something that's definitely a public interest in terms of the amount of space that these things take up in the public right of way. These telephone poles are, I forget what the structure is, but the pole sits on public land. It may be owned by Verizon or Comcast or whoever, but the pole sits on public land. And so, that's something that I may want to have a deeper conversation with DPW about what are the sort of the easement rights that are there? How far do they extend off of the actual circumference of the pole? And then I think definitely something that can go into zoning is, a requirement that you've got to keep, a minimum, clearance on the sidewalk. And if not, that's a consideration for alternative locations or alternative designs that, perhaps put that equipment, up the pole, not so you bump your head on it, but, there's not a ton of variety in this stuff, but I mean, these are issues that everyone wrestles with. And I think there is sufficient flexibility to kind of achieve, everyone's goals. But I think we would be well within our rights to make sure that these things are not blocking, an accessible sidewalk, 100%.
Absolutely. That's great, Tim. Thank you very much. We definitely would like to be ahead of that. So keeping us moving tonight, the discussion of the special town meeting warrant article on the access road easement. Tim, do you want to is there anything you would like to say about this? I know we've all had a chance to review the article.
Yeah, have I talked about this previously? Do I have to go through the whole thing again?
You talked about, yes.
Yeah, so, again, this is something that, would provide better access for that 40B project, safer access. It would entail improvements to the dump access road that the town would otherwise be on the hook for. So all in all, we think it's a good deal, for the town. The warrant committee voted last week to recommend. So the draft that I sent you, at least that Article 4 was approved by the warrant committee. So, I think we're in decently good shape to get moving and have this, and make a persuasive case to town meeting in December.
Great. And I think in our past discussion, Maggie, sorry, go ahead, you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah. So I had asked before, but I'm just going to ask again. I probably know the answer, but I know I was just wondering if the developer has submitted any new plans or better plans to the project. I think, of course, I support this. I think it makes kind of a not so great project a little bit less not so great. But I'm thinking that, it's a big ask of the developer to, for the town and town meeting to support him. And I was just wondering if he's considered giving the town a better project in some way, like increasing a buffer or increasing the design or a better landscape plan. So I know he doesn't have to, but I just think, again, because he lives in Milton, he's a local developer. He lives right up the street on Randolph Ave. So I just think it might be a nice thing if he is asked to do something a little bit more or make some sort of financial contribution to the animal shelter, because that's going to be his neighbor. So I don't know if he's talked about any of those things. And I know that's outside the scope of this, but I was just asking.
Yeah, and I mean, you raise a lot of good issues. And I guess what I'll say is the reason that the town is pursuing this is because so far, and obviously it's up to town meeting to make the ultimate determination, but on a kind of a staff level, we think that it's in the best interest of the town to do this. That being said, and I can show you, I'll share my screen in just a minute. We don't have fully kind of worked up plans for what the site plan would look like with this access. The developer is not going to kind of make that investment in doing fully engineered plans without the assurance that they're actually going to be able to do it. But they do have kind of, schematic conceptual engineering plans that they provided earlier in the public hearing process, just to kind of show, what the implications of this change would be. And so, I'll zoom in just a little bit. The current plan has the access coming off this driveway. And, we don't have to go too deep into it with the side-by-side, but, the improvements that are necessary to this driveway are immense. The pavement needs to be widened. There's a lot of topography that needs to be cut into. The entryway into the 718 Randolph property needs to be entirely redone. There's huge switchbacks for pedestrian access. It's bananas. It works in a technical way, but it is far from, if you were drawing up what you would consider to be, a really ideal site plan, you would not draw it that way. This is closer to the ideal site plan for this project on this site. And so you've got, barely any, touching of this area. This will probably wind up being, a secondary emergency access for the, first responders. So you'll probably make a connection between the end of this parking lot and the driveway, but otherwise very little touching of this area. There are two options here. This one looks like this. This one looks like this. They may decide to do a third thing. But what you see is, compared to the current site plan, the building is as far away as it can get from the abutter that would have the maximum impact. And there's just a lot more flexibility of where to site the building and where to site the the parking lot. So these aren't explicit, like, quid pro quo things, but just the fact that, access from the access road opens up the site and kind of loosens the site in a way that just yields a better site plan. They aren't kind of specific, explicit asks. They're just things that are now able to be happened. And I think what you'll see in the public hearing, if and when town meetings approves this, is a little bit more, analysis and review of what their actual landscaping plan is going to be, and what, any type of engineering changes that need to happen. And I think that's where you'll have an opportunity, again, maybe not explicit kind of, asks to go above and beyond, but, there's much more opportunity to improve the project, in the way that we typically see on maybe smaller projects. So I think there's opportunity to kind of continue to improve this if this is the way the site plan can work.
Don't stop your share.
All right, whatever.
Just quickly, I am supportive of this article and this access, but I think the board should weigh in on the new site plans. We weighed in on the initial application, and we can provide some of our input into the ZBA. For example, this plan puts a 5-story building, 10 feet from that northern property line. And I know that that's a barn now, but that property that limits somebody else's use of their property next door to have a building with we don't know what that facade is, how tall and wide and long, et cetera, is. Does it have any relief? So this plan might be a better plan for that purpose. And so I just think it's important for us to have a conversation about the plans and to weigh in on it. But I would like to say that Meredith, speaking on behalf of the planning board in December, should say that we support the idea of this, and we support the access, but that we do think that design consideration is an important factor in how they develop this, and that we wouldn't want to see it rushed into approving where the building's located on the parcel.
I agree. And the ZBA hearing, they have kept it open. So I think we should have definitely an opportunity, and we should have comments
Yeah.
on the design.
And I think one way to kind of think about this, and the good news is that this will be the only 40B left, and so we can focus our attention on it and not have to juggle 3 or 4 at the same time. So, the timeline on this is, we've got, early December town meeting. The public hearing is continued until January 24th. The thinking being that, the developer will sort of now know what the town meeting vote has been, and then spend another, 6 weeks, working up the engineering plans, the landscape plans, the design plans, for presentation on the 24th. And then the deadline for the Board of Appeals to make a decision on the project has been extended until, I think, the end of February. So there's kind of 6 weeks from town meeting to the next public hearing, and then another month from that public hearing till decision time. So I think, one way the board may want to approach this is, once town meeting votes, and you guys can think about this for the next couple of weeks, once town meeting votes, maybe put together a set of principles that you'd want to see in a site plan. Not necessarily reacting to anything that's on paper because we don't have anything yet, but these are the priorities that we think that a site plan should respond to. And then once we actually have it, then you can kind of take a look and see, is it responsive? Is it not? Can we provide some additional advice? So it is an opportunity to kind of get in front of this in a way that we really haven't for other projects, just because of the schedule and just the way that they've been reviewed. So I think that there's good opportunity for good input here.
Great, that's terrific. So with that,
did you want to take a vote to?
Yeah, I was going to ask for a motion to support the warrant, the town meeting article on the access road easement.
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Great. Roll call. Rich?
Yes.
Sean?
Yes.
Cheryl?
Yes.
Maggie?
Yes.
And myself, yes. That's great. So we can give our support to that. All right. Now, I know there's some members of the community, Mr. Jackson being one, who had wanted to, who I think are here for the discussion of the MBTA communities, multifamily zoning and update. Would it be okay with the board if we just move this up on our agenda so that we don't keep people all evening? And then we can go to our discussion of FY23 budget priorities and the update on zoning. Would that be okay? Okay. So Tim, when we last met, and I'm not sure, I think people are still just learning about this and finding out. Do you want to just briefly touch on the presentation that you made and when that will be on the website and available for people to see?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we're putting together a page off of the planning department website as a kind of clearinghouse for information on MBTA community. So we'll provide links to all the state information, and then as we have discussions, make presentations, produce materials, that'll be where that stuff lives. We're hoping to get that live next week, so just stay tuned. It'll be again off of the planning department webpage. There'll be a link on the left side of the page. We can put it out on the town social media when it's eventually live. So it's just a situation where one thing, and this is something that actually we're looking into as a town, is kind of upgrading our kind of public facing website so that's a little bit more flexible and user friendly. Users in the public and users who actually are posting on it. You have to do a lot of thinking ahead of time for how the page is going to be designed, which is why I'm not trying to dodge anyone by just not like throwing something up there, but because I know that we're going to be producing a lot of material on this, I want to make sure that we're kind of thinking critically about how to present it in the most organized way. So all of that is to say, we'll have a page up next week. I'll throw that presentation up. In the meantime, if anyone wants to see it, happy to share it.
And it's on Milton Access cable. People can go on in
Yeah,
March,
yeah,
before
and that can, yeah, and we can, yeah,
October 13th
so-
meeting. Yeah.
so that's up there. And on that, the sort of the meat of that presentation, and it's something that I think the board's going to have to continue to think about, is kind of the fundamental question of, do we want to keep MBTA community zone in the transit zone, or do we want to spread it around? That's a kind of a gating type issue that we need to talk about. There are a couple things that are not, I guess, breaking news, maybe not breaking, but a couple things that I wanted to talk about under this agenda item. One is revised guidance relative to affordable housing, which I think I may have disseminated, but we can walk through those bullets, quickly. Another thing is we had talked at the last meeting about potentially inviting members of the elected delegation to come in and speak to MBTA communities legislation. I'd like to, I'd like that ask to come from Meredith. Obviously, I will help her write any letter that that we need to send. But I think the board should have a little bit of a discussion of what do we want to learn from the elected delegation? What do we want them to learn from us? What are we asking for? They're great. I'm sure they'd come, but I always want to sort of provide them with as much information as possible when we extend an invitation to come speak. So that's another thing that I think we should probably talk about. And then the third thing is, and this is included in the materials, I think we'd like to start. So here's actual breaking news. I got this today. So we did get a $50,000 grant from the state to do MBTA communities technical assistance. So that was very good news. We'll be able to bring on consultant help to help us sort through all this stuff. And so I think initiating that conversation of what do we want to know, what do we need help with, what are the types of things that can happen in-house. So I have some thoughts on that based on some stuff that we're expecting to get from the state. And then I also provided a sort of a scope of work and a set of responses that Town of Dedham put out earlier this year in the spring to help them kind of get a jump on things, just as sort of an example of here's how other towns are thinking, and here's the types of services that a certain type of consultant can provide. So I think kind of walking through that, would be helpful. So those were my kind of 3 priorities under this agenda item tonight.
All right. Did any board members have any questions from last week and from Tim's presentation that you might want to ask?
I want to say it's great news that we got the grant, because I think it's really important. I did read through the information that Tim provided Dedham and the 2 responses that they received. And to respond to what Tim said about some decisions and some outreach, I think given that the requirement of a district along Elliott Street corridor, let's call it, is an absolute requirement, I think that there should be outreach to that community that is kind of goes into the community. So let's say a public meeting held somewhere in that vicinity, maybe it's a walking kind of tour talking about the area. And I think it would be helpful if Tim had some information about the current density that's there, like the current zoning that's there, including Milton Hill House, including 88 Wharf, so people can, and 36 Central, like 36 Central is how many units per acre, just so people, when they're walking, they visualize, and they can look at and they can see like, okay, here is an area that might have a 5,000 square foot lot with a 2-family on it, and what kind of density is that? Because I think some information is powerful, and I think lack of information causes fear. And so I think we need to be tackling this from a point of view of providing information and gathering information. So we're going to gather information from the people who who live in that area. We're going to gather information from experts that we hire, and we're going to gather information from our experts in our planning department, right? And so that's my suggestion about that piece of it. The next piece of it is I absolutely think, because of what Tim said, if it's limited to that area, it's going to drive density high, that we can't impose all of the density on that area. So I, for one, as a planning board member, think that we need to think about spreading it out into some other areas like Tim, and whether it's the exact areas that Tim suggested, I think is up for discussion. But just the basic question, should it be one district along the trolley or not? My answer would be not.
Sean, you had your hand up next to speak.
Thanks, Meredith. I think the grant is excellent. I'm pleased we have that money to work with. To support the idea of engagement with the community, I am 100% an advocate for engaging the community. However, although the impact could be significant in the area that's Elliott Street, the impact will be significant to every resident in the town. And I will go back to what I had said in our last meeting on this topic. I feel we owe every citizen in the town a comprehensive review of the impacts of this. I stand by what I said. If we add 25% of the residential units we have in town, we will affect every single service that we provide: police service, fire service, DPW service, utilities, and absolutely the school services. So the review, and I looked through what was provided from, some of the letters, Tim. I think they were in response to some of the other towns that were looking for impact analysis. It seems to me that the impact that I'm reading in this letter is that the consultants are providing are really just planning impacts. They don't mention at all cost impacts for the town. And in the end, the cost impact for the town will be borne by the residents, through our property taxes. So although it may affect a particular neighborhood in terms of density, as Cheryl described, it's going to affect every single taxpayer in town if we increase the residential units that the zoning would allow, and the impact that it will have on all of our services throughout the town. So, our responsibility is to look at all impacts, not just planning, but the cost impacts for every single department that will be affected. And if we are going to use funds that are provided to us for evaluating this, I will be an ardent advocate for exploring all cost impacts that the town will incur as a result if we were to adopt this.
Yeah, so I think, and again, Sean, those are great points. And I think one of the things that I had mentioned is kind of, discerning what can we do in-house? What do we need expert help with? There's a world in which, if you had more money, you could just, bring in someone to do all the work, and they would do the zoning analysis, and they would conduct, all of the outreach, and they would do all of these impacts. We don't have a ton of money. And so one thing that I would kind of, and before we make a decision on kind of, putting together a scope of work, and this would be, again, we've got $50,000. I would think of this as, a sort of sub $50,000 contract, so that we can kind of, target it towards firms that we kind of think, are capable of doing the work without doing the full, solicitation, unless we wanted to put more money behind it, which is obviously the board's prerogative to do. But one thing that I want to, unfortunately, and I was hoping that this would be ready, before we had to make this decision immediately, but it will be ready soon. The Commonwealth is putting together, and I'm going to share my screen again, something that they call a compliance model. And this is going to be this is from a presentation that DHCD has given a number of times. And this is really a tool that is going to be used by every community to kind of input like, okay, it's going to be tied into a common GIS database. And it'll be a tool by which, towns can kind of put in the borders of their district and input the, height and density and kind of other dimensional requirements, and use that as a means to test against the gross density and multifamily unit capacity requirements of the legislation. All of which is to say, this is going to be, if it's everything that the Commonwealth says it's cracked up to be, it's going to be a very powerful tool for us to test things and to say, okay, what if a district was this size and had this dimensional restriction? And so this may be something where on this one discrete aspect of kind of technical analysis, we may be able to do more of that in-house and be able to put more of other responsibilities on an outside consultant. They're anticipating releasing this thing in November. Whether that means early November or late November is up to be determined. But I think once we see what this compliance model is capable of, we'll have a better idea specifically of like, okay, I can do this, with help from some outside folks that can provide advice, and then let's spend money on someone that, does sewer stuff or whatever. So I think, this is the beginning of a conversation of here's the type of things we want to study. And then, at a later time, we can kind of hash out, we definitely need outside help, or this is definitely something that we can handle kind of as a staff. So I think, that's the first step of kind of identifying like, okay, we need to know this impact, that impact, that impact. Who can tell us this stuff?
Sean, did you have something else?
Yeah, I do. And I definitely understand that that 50,000 will not, it goes fast, right? In the world of consulting, very fast. I also think we have some really capable people in our town, residents that might be able to help us evaluate. I mean, people that are financial people that, that work in the world of budgets and cost. And I listen to town meeting. There's many people that stand at town meeting that are capable financial people. We might be able to put together a working group that could help us evaluate, some of this. So it's a suggestion, Meredith and Tim, that we potentially look at that.
Absolutely. And members of the warrant committee, I mean, this is, what is the cost benefit analysis?
It's not, this is a very, very, very big initiative. If the town of Milton, if this becomes an approved initiative for the town of Milton, I would say the last, you think about this, we're talking about creating zoning that would allow the town to increase by 25%. And as you said, Tim, we don't know whether it would or it wouldn't, right? It would be a matter of creating zoning, and whether it ever comes to be, none of us, could know. However, we'd be creating zoning that would allow it to happen. And then there's plenty of economic impacts that would dictate whether it can or cannot happen, as you had said last week. But, this is, I think it is, when I think about 25% increase of residential units in the town, I think the last thing that happened to Milton that would be as significant was the Southeast Expressway dividing the town. I look at it, it is that magnitude of change to Milton. That's how I look at it. So I really feel like we have to do the very best for the residents of the town to study this and make sure that if this is approved, that A, the residents of the town are in support of it, and B, it's a good decision for the town.
Thank you for your comments, Sean. And Maggie, you had your hand up also.
Yeah, so I'm kind of wondering if there's a way that we can slow this process down a little bit. I know that we have deadlines to meet, but I've talked to quite a number of residents in that area in the past, since our last meeting, and most of them have no idea what's happening. So even today, I reached out to two people. And they're younger, they're newer to town, been in town like, probably 10 years. And they're busy raising their kids and working, and they have no idea what's going on. And they are nervous about it, and they're asking questions. And so some of the questions that they're asking me, and I don't have the answer to, unfortunately, is one, since it's considered, an MBTA mass transit initiative, has a study been done about the usage of the trolley? Now, I grew up riding the trolley. I love the trolley, but there comes a point where maybe we have to look at the use of the trolley and see if it's no longer worthwhile having, if it's going to cause all these impacts. And I haven't taken a position. I'm not in support of one thing or another, but these are the questions people are asking. In particular, the two people that I spoke to today, they said that they've never used the trolley, and they live on Cliff Road and on Elliott. They would be disappointed if the trolley left because their kids are going to be going to BC High, but they would find alternative transportation. They love their neighborhood so much that they would rather see a trolley cease operations in it than them having to move out of their neighborhood. So I don't know if that has been looked into. And, what would happen if we did not create zoning at this point in time? So it seems like, the requirements have changed a couple times since the zoning, since we learned about the zoning. And so I'm wondering why would we have to be one of the communities out in the forefront? Couldn't we be one that kind of came along a little bit later to see what actually ultimately we required, what was required of us? And I even looked into, the towns or the cities of New Bedford and Fall River, and the rail line is extending down there, and there's a group of residents down there who are actually fighting it because they're thinking that when the MBTA comes, it's going to bring headaches and financial woes to them. So even those cities, which I would think would benefit greatly with a train service, there's part of those people in those communities who are not supportive of this. So I'm just wondering if, instead of moving forward, can't we look to see if there's something we can do to slow it down? The town of Rockport, they did pass their zoning barely in town meeting. I think it was like an 89 to 83 vote, like 6 votes. So that was really close, but because of the now majority, a simple majority, it passed. And 10 residents in the town of Rockport are now appealing the zoning. So should we wait and see kind of what happens with that appeal before kind of rushing in creating zoning when maybe we might not have to?
So a couple things, and I'll address the kind of the general kind of timeline kind of question. I'll be perfectly frank with everybody here in the meeting and watching at home, that it would be, how do I say this without going on the record saying something crazy? It would not surprise me if we did not have zoning done by December 31st, 2023. And I don't mean that to speculate on, well, I think town meeting is going to reject it and whatever, but I do think it is such a big task, and it is going to require so much effort that, and I'll say this, even the folks at DHCD who are administering this program and have issued these guidelines have basically said to towns, you should bake in at least 2 town meetings. Just the nature of town meeting, as Maggie said, people are still kind of hearing about this and learning about this in the run up to town meeting. I mean, we do have a year, before a potential fall 23 town meeting. More people will learn about this, more people will be involved, but we all know that town meeting is kind of the ultimate instigator of kind of people's knowledge of things. And so even DHCD has said, your timeline should probably include multiple bites at the town meeting apple, to kind of see what works, and to kind of allow for the possibility that town meeting doesn't go for it on the first try. And so I think, with the amount of work that's going to need to go into this, again, it would not surprise me if December 31st, 2023 rolls around and we're a non-compliant community. I think on the face of it, that is not an earth-shattering kind of consequence. What it's going to mean is in fiscal 24 or calendar year 24, we won't be eligible for these grant programs. We will be eligible once we pass zoning, potentially at a annual 2024 town meeting, if that's the case. The unknowns that I've talked about at previous meetings are the things that, I don't know how much to be concerned about in terms of, is it a big deal if we're kind of 6 months behind? Probably not. But the longer we stay out of compliance, the longer we're exposed to, again, those unknown consequences, whether it's from the state or from the development community. So I think when we talk about, slowing down, I think everything that we're talking about right now is, still at the pace of our choosing. Sean is talking about, fiscal infrastructure, other types of impacts that I think, need to be analyzed and need to be studied. And, studying those is gonna open up a lot of lines of inquiry, and I think it's gonna answer a lot of questions. I'll be perfectly honest that they're questions that we should be asking regardless of whether the state's requiring us to do zoning or not. I think understanding what our capabilities are for growth and development is an important thing to understand as a town. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity to sort of do this at the pace that people are comfortable with, that still kind of moves forward progress, but also kind of brings people along and helps them learn and gives everyone an opportunity to provide meaningful impact. I don't want to go too far into a conversation about the continued existence of the trolley. Maggie, you're just putting information out there. I understand you're not taking a position. I'll take a position right now. It would be a bad idea if the trolley went away, and I don't think that we should support anything like that. So I think, the folks in Fall River and New Bedford are in a different situation. That train line is currently being built. The decision that they have to face is, do they sign up and pay to be part of the MBTA service area or not? We are already part of the MBTA service area. We pay a significant amount of money every year for T service. It's a tremendous asset to our community and is has the potential to unlock tremendous economic development and climate change resilience and equity opportunities. And so I think we need to be, full tilt, behind the trolley, regardless of whether the zoning happens or doesn't happen or what decision we make there. So I'd much rather have a knockdown drag out about zoning than talk about, well, maybe we shouldn't be part of the T and let's get rid of the trolley. So that's just that. If people feel strongly about it, we can continue to talk about it maybe at a later meeting, but I see Rich has his hand up.
Yes, I was gonna say, Rich.
Yeah, so what is there, I don't want to ask a question that it seems like I don't know what well, all right, sorry, it's getting late, I'm getting tired. What am I saying? What is the proposed process here? Because I do agree with a lot of different statements that are being made, right? I'm really nervous about this. I do agree that we got to do something because I worry that inaction is worse than the alternative, because if you don't do nothing, then the state looks at you as, all right, well, so you're not trying anything. So you're digging your heels in and doing nothing. I worry about that because if every town did that, the laws are just going to get tougher and they're going to force you to do something. But I also don't want to see our town go in a really bad direction, as Sean's putting. So I guess who drives the bus here, Tim? Like who's supposed to say, yes, we are as a town doing something, or no, we're not? I mean, the select board must have an opinion on this, right? I mean, this is fairly big.
So the decision, the immediate decision that needs to be made from a kind of state compliance perspective is the state is looking for an action plan for how we're going to consider crafting this zoning. I think I've shared the link to the action plan. It's a very simple and kind of, quite frankly, rudimentary form. There's some information requests, and the main things that they really want to know is, have you generally identified areas where you may potentially want to, craft zoning for, and what is your timeline for getting to town meeting? And so that's the only thing that, and I'll say that's the only imperative thing. What winds up happening is if we don't submit it by the end of January 2023, then we're out of compliance for 2023. I suspect if we got it in the middle of February, for instance, we'd be okay. But I think there's actually plenty of time to get that form together. It is it's a low stakes form in the sense that we could submit it and then we're good for a year. If we wanted to submit an application for a MassWorks grant to do an infrastructure project or submit an application for something else, we'd be able to do that. And it's not, none of it's really binding because it's just information. And so a part of that is feeding into that action plan is like, okay, we have some funding for consultant services. What types of consultant services do we want to seek? When are we going to go out and have public meetings? When are we going to have a draft of zoning ready? When do we anticipate potentially a planning board public hearing happening? They just want to see that we're thinking about how to get to town meeting. If we say, oh yeah, we'll have a public hearing in August, and then August rolls around and we don't have a public hearing, 30 lashes with a wet noodle. I don't know what the state will do. We will have submitted our action plan and hopefully made a good faith effort to follow it. So it really is kind of encouraging us to think about it. And then, the next deadline after that is that December 31st, 2023 deadline where, do you have zoning or do you not have zoning? So I think feeding into that is a discussion of what do we feel we need expert services for? Let's start to draft up an RFP, and then, that scope of work and that timeline will feed into the action plan, and we'll say we've got a consultant, we'll get them on board in January, and we'll start, having public meetings, we'll do this walking tour, we'll have a meeting at town hall, do whatever. So that's really kind of the timeline. A lot of it is just, again, the town having the flexibility to create its own plan and to work at its own pace. So that's
good info. Sorry, Austin. That's really good info. I guess so my further question though is, because again, hearing everybody on the board, and I feel the same way, I can probably agree with a lot of different comments from everybody that's made comments on this. But I guess what I'm hearing you say, it's maybe too soon to take a position because we haven't dove in. I'm summarizing, right? What you're saying, it's too soon to take a position. So kind of like a let's not go there. I only push back on that a little bit because I think people are very afraid. Folks get afraid when they see something as big as this without having a little bit more like what's around the corner. And so I don't know. Well, I don't know if they've taken a position on this, but I'm not even looking for the select board to have a, hey, this is, 3 to 2, we agree that it should be this. I'm hoping they have a conversation about this so I can watch it. I would love to know where that select, I mean, they're the highest board in the town, right? That they, if this is so big that could change, like drastically change things in town, they really should weigh in up front, I think, and give us some thoughts, because it's, and I think the worry from some people is, well, if we go down this road at all, we're making it seem like to the public that we're interested in doing this. And so there's this worry, and I don't mean to put words in anybody else's mouth on this committee, this board, but I almost feel like people are afraid to move forward. Because I'm hearing Cheryl say, we can't do inaction. All we kind of siding with what you're saying, Tim, we should do something just to get ahead of it so we understand. That doesn't mean we're going to go one way or another. We need to start understanding. And I'm almost feeling like folks are a little afraid of that because they don't want to start making it seem like they're taking a position to go down that road. And so how do we get around that?
Yeah, so I actually, I've kind of, I had briefed the select board a couple weeks ago on this process, especially as it relates to the action plan, because, I work for them, and basically I don't want to sort of submit something to DHCD that they haven't explicitly told me, Tim, go ahead and do this.
Right.
And where they landed was, to continue to work through the sort of the process of, again, learning what the requirements are, and kind of taking the steps to sort of get a draft action plan together. So I'm kind of due, back in front of them, by the end of the year, probably potentially beginning of 2023, with a draft action plan that they can then look at and say like, okay, go ahead and send this in or not. And I think they were very, and I think Rich, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, they were very much cognizant of, and I tried to reassure them that like, this is, it's pushing paper to the state. This is not like, I think MBTA communities is a great idea, so Tim, write a good action plan. It's more like, we're going to continue to sort of, comply in the ways that the state has, has laid out, and use that time to, again, continue to ask questions, to get answers to those questions, to kind of learn what we need to learn, and make an informed decision before anyone is compelled to take a position on anything. I've made my thoughts clear, but I'm staff. I don't think anyone should feel like, taking a step to sort of hire someone to gather information for us is tantamount to anything except for we're trying to learn more and kind of figure things out. I definitely understand it's a big deal, and people may see, any step in any direction, can be interpreted as a step forward. And I guess what I would say is, to keep an open mind about, asking those questions and learning what the results may be. We could hire an engineering firm to kind of study our infrastructure, and it turns out that, we'll make $1 jillion on new water fees, and it'll be a net positive for the community, and everything will be fine. And, we'll have Sean on board.
So this sounds,
that probably won't happen. But
one last question in there is, so I agree with everything you just said. I like that thought and what the select board is thinking, and I'm not too worried. I feel like I wouldn't. Obviously, we're not making commitments, so I like the plan that you're talking about. And that's with me still saying I don't know what the end result's going to look like, which I think is appropriate at this point. Last question would be, then understanding that that's where the select board is kind of leaning. You're not really. It's not for the select the select board could kind of go down that road themselves. So it's not like, am I wrong? Like, it's not like we have to say yes, go do it, or no, you can't, or yes, you can. I mean, I don't think we're as powerful to say that this is dead today. Like the select board could kind of say, yes, we're going to go do this, right?
Yeah. So I'm kind of, I've got a foot in two places right now, in the sense that, ultimately, I work for the town administrator. The town administrator works for the select board. So, it's something that ultimately, because there are townwide impacts on both compliance and non-compliance, I thought it was good for the select board to kind of, have a hand on the steering wheel, part of this. That being said, this is going to be zoning. This is going to be something that is, generally right in the wheelhouse of the planning board.
Right.
So, the idea of kind of getting the okay to send the action plan to DHCD is kind of a submission from one form of government to another form of government. I want the select board to be a part of that. As it relates to actually putting the content of that plan together, as kind of rudimentary and informal as that content is, I think it's probably more appropriate to talk about in this forum, in terms of like, okay, here's what we think a public process is going to look like. Here's what we think, a sort of an impact analysis is going to look like, and this is going to affect the timeline. I think those are appropriate conversations to have here to kind of feed into what that draft action plan is going to look like.
Thank you. And Cheryl, you have your hand up, and then I do want to hear from any residents from the public who would like to speak to this. So Cheryl, if you could.
Yeah, I think, Tim, you said you'd like to hear what we think we want to, the analysis that we think we need to do, and then maybe start thinking about how it gets done. So from what I'm hearing, I'd like to sort of give some bullet points to that. So I think a community engagement piece, initially just to even bring awareness to people. Okay, so I have felt as if sometimes there's misinformation about initiatives that then becomes hard to kind of get people to the same starting place. So I think it's really great if we can get everybody on the same starting place and understanding. So a community engagement piece. Another piece is a build out analysis, or, where would this go, right? So how would that work? And then what impacts would that build out have? There's not just fiscal impacts, but there's quality of life impacts. Are there going to be playgrounds in the vicinity? Will there need to be other kinds of amenities that people might be able to walk to? Because if you have much more development, will that make traffic worse? And so beginning to understand the impacts, and then what the fiscal impacts would be on services, the delivery of town services, another piece of it. And I think there's going to be different experts required for all of those. And I think those quality of life and fiscal impacts really can't come until you do the build out analysis. And I think you need the community engagement, not just at the beginning, but along the way. So you need to design a really robust community engagement process. And I think that means going to the communities. These kinds of meetings on Zoom, I don't think are going to be the best way to get people engaged on this. So go to the precincts that are initially impacted by it. I appreciate that Sean thinks that, the whole town will be impacted by it. And in some ways it will, but the greatest impacts will be in the places where this is zoned. And we know right now it's mandated in particular areas and the others are flexible. And so I think we need to start there. I think it's important to start there. And then we can go beyond that area. So then once we have, and there may be other things that we haven't talked about that residents will throw out to us as some things that we need to put on the list. But I think once we get the list, then we get the timeline for the list, the resources involved for it, and we have the beginnings of a plan. Otherwise, I think we just talk, and it's hard to see progress if we don't have a plan. So those are my parting sentiments on this before we hear from the public.
Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, I know Mr. Jackson had wanted to speak earlier, and we have another resident, Donna Dickerson. If we can let Pete Jackson in and then followed by Donna Dickerson, please. And anyone else from the public we'd love to hear from.
Pete, I think if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to talk.
Also, could I please get a address from you?
Sure. Peter Jackson, 14 Capon Street, right in the middle of the impact area. I hardly know where to begin. From when I first heard of this, I wondered where the MBTA got off thinking that they were in the business of local zoning. But it's legislatively mandated. So one way or another, something's got to happen. I know that the state is in great need of housing in order to stay competitively and things like that. But the need is affordable housing, and there's no affordability built into this. It's an option for communities, but there's no affordability built into it. So what they're demanding is a 25% increase in our residential buildings of market rate housing. And that's not what the state needs. So, I think there's a lot of blindness into the notion of what this is. When I was trying to look into this more, and I heard about it months ago or a year ago, whenever, but I looked on the town's website to try to get information on, how the planning board, how the selectmen, how everybody was going. I couldn't find one thing anywhere on the website. I looked in the selectmen, I looked town administrators, I looked in the planning board office, I looked in the engineering office. There is not one thing available to the public on the website about what this is or what the approach the community is taking, things like that. So I think, Tim, your notion of getting, a robust element on the planning board website, and maybe links to it on the select board's website or whatever, so that the public has an opportunity to learn about this, I think is important. I'm glad to hear, number one, all your comments. I think the board realizes the impact this is going to have and the difficulty of making these decisions. So I appreciate hearing that. My understanding, and Tim, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that 50% of this need, or of the minimum of 50 acres they're requiring us to create, has to be within their, what you're calling the transit area, the half mile from the stations. I'm glad it's not 100% of it. Any approach to do 100% of it would be disastrous for our neighborhood. But the notion of 50% of it in the neighborhood here and 50% of it dispersed through town, I think, provides a little bit of equity to the approach. And I would encourage the board and the town to seriously consider, limiting the impact on the transit area to 50% of the impact. And I don't know if that's 50% of the number of units or 50% of the required 50 acres of zoning. But I think, these are important issues. And I was thinking that maybe the board was further along with its thinking and its debate, but I understand that's very early in the process.
Thank you, Pete.
The density, I wonder, and again, this is off and speaking up top of my head, but the density increase near the T, for years they've been touting the idea of transit-oriented development, which I've always thought is a good idea, because more reliability on public transit, for environmental reasons and keeping people off the roads and the infrastructure, I think it's a good thing. So the idea of building up density by there, but this is so radical. I'm wondering to what extent this is a way to just increase ridership of the T to try to solve their financial problems, as opposed to any need for housing. Again, since it's not affordable housing, I support affordable housing and I don't mind it, in a reasonable amount in my neighborhood, but the whole town has to deal with it. When you create these areas, target areas for the zoning, I don't know if, areas that are parks and open space, that are protected already, if that falls within the area, is that part of the acreage required? If you drew your half mile acreage from Milton Station, you've got 88 Wharf, you've got the wharf itself, you've got the parks and open space along there, you've got property that's already publicly protected. Is that part of the acreage, even though it might not be developable? I'm not sure how that fits into the whole thing. In the select board's letter, which I just saw today that they wrote with their initial comments on this, they asked whether East Milton Square could be part of it because it's got bus service. I don't know if they ever got a real response for that, but if 50% of it can be outside the transit area, and there's all these units already being discussed and planned, can those units be part of the town's response? Because they're not, I know units that have already been built can't be, but those are future units. And if that's part of the zoning area, will those units count toward the requirement of what they're talking about? I think that's an important question. I was distressed to learn, and I'm sure the planning board feels this way too, that I guess there was a change in the 2/3 requirement for zoning articles to pass, and it's now a simple majority. I think that has a horrendous impact on, the importance of zoning, and that's a thing. I think the last thing I'll say at this time, and there's a million questions in my head and things like that, but the increase in density in our neighborhood along Elliott Street is going to have a negative impact on our property values, no question about it. So what is that going to mean for, what is the equity? Is the town going to is the state going to reimburse us for our loss in property value due to this excessive zoning? Is it going to drive, this is a desirable neighborhood in part because of the trolley. That's why I moved here 35 years ago, is because the trolley provided my wife and I public transportation access to Cambridge, where she worked, and downtown where I worked. And this is a very desirable neighborhood. But if the zoning increase is drastic like this, particularly when it's a neighborhood of small lots and single family homes, what the solution is going to be to adding, 1,200 more units into our neighborhood. That's probably what we've got already is 1,200. So that double our density. But the impact on property values and our quality of life is going to be tremendous. So I don't know what the approach you're going to take, but it's going to be very difficult, I think, getting out to the public, explaining what's going on, because nobody I know in our neighborhood is even talking about this yet, because they've heard something's happening with the T zoning, but what it means and what it means for our neighborhood really has not come out anywhere yet. So there has to be a robust community engagement, and it's a very dangerous and impactful thing that's going to be happening to our community and to our neighborhood. And so I encourage you and the select board, as it appears that you are, is taking this very seriously, but also really assessing the impacts. That's enough for now. I'll be back. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pete. We really appreciate those very thoughtful comments. And Tim, I don't know if you have any answers to some of the questions that Pete
Yeah, there was a bunch there, and I'll try to cover as much as I can. But Pete, it would be awesome if I miss anything, because there are other folks that I think want to talk. If I miss anything, please shoot me an email and we can continue this conversation offline if you have specific questions. But one thing relative to the very beginning of Pete's comments about the need for housing and affordable housing, it's very clear to everyone who has studied this issue that the region needs housing at every level, every income level, from luxury down to transitional housing for homeless folks. Every type of housing is necessary. And what I'll just refer to is, and this just came out this week, the Boston Foundation and the Donahue Institute at UMass puts together a Greater Boston Housing Report Card every year. And under supply, they say a healthy housing market needs abundant housing options to meet the needs of all families who hope to live in our region. This includes having a diverse range of housing types, large single-family homes, dense triple-deckers, small single-room occupancy units. Housing diversity ensures that people can enter the market at different price points and that different household types filter into units that match their needs. These homes should be spread throughout the full region so that all families have the option of living where they see best fit. The market functions smoothly. This will likely lead to greater housing density near transit, near job centers, near walkable downtowns, and near the best public schools. While the first order effect of building more housing is to moderate market rate housing costs, it also increases the number of families that subsidized housing programs can serve. With lower market rate housing costs, each public dollar going towards subsidized housing construction or preservation can cover more units. Similarly, rental vouchers can stretch further or cover more families. So in the sense that any housing supply increase helps everybody. And that's the struggle that we've been in. But that being said, and I mentioned this earlier under this agenda item, that there's been revised guidance from DHCD regarding housing affordability. You'll recall from the initial final guidelines that towns were able to have an inclusionary component to their MBTA communities, multifamily zoning, but you couldn't do it at a level greater than 10% of all units. And you couldn't do it at levels of area median income higher than 80%, such that all units were required to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory. I think DHCD heard from a lot of towns who have other ideas about inclusionary zoning. And so they've made a couple of adjustments to the guidance. One is which is to modify the definition of affordable unit to eliminate the requirement that affordable units be eligible for listing on the SHI. So that gives you a little more flexibility if you want to do 80% AMI units, 100% AMI units, up to 120%. Allow communities to set income limits for affordable units below 80% AMI, provided that the community demonstrates that a reasonable variety of multifamily housing types can be feasibly developed at the proposed affordability levels. You can require more than 10%, but not more than 20%, provided that you demonstrate that your zoning can feasibly create units, because that's been the concern all along of towns setting too high a level so that projects couldn't pencil out. And then there's an exception to the 20% cap on affordable units, but quite frankly, wouldn't apply to Milton. So there's increased flexibility on the affordability component of all of this. So that's definitely something that we can continue to take into account. There were a number of other questions. I think that to the extent that there are areas in the sort of half-mile transit area, and this is something we've been talking about since the initial draft guidelines came out. One aspect of the final guidelines is that the state has created a kind of a metric by which they determine what they consider to be developable land, and so that's what drives the ability for towns to do greater portions of their district outside of the transit zone. If we only had one trolley stop and half of the half-mile radius was in the middle of the river, we would probably be able to have more area outside of that transit zone to be able to use, to comply with the guidelines. The fact that we have 4 stations and are in the catchment area of a 5th station, even though a significant portion of that is in the DCR reservation, is in the middle of the river, does include, Shields Park and other kind of conservation and recreation lands. We're still considered to have enough developable land in all of those half-mile radii that we have to have half of our district in that area. And so DHCD is kind of already baked in that analysis into those requirements. And just the last thing that I want to say, and again, and Pete, if I miss anything, please absolutely follow up via email. This is an initiative that started in the state legislature specifically to address the regional housing supply issue. I don't have any knowledge of, quite frankly, the T being involved in the creation of this. They were involved in kind of working with DHCD to create the guidelines, but I don't think anyone is looking at, this as necessarily a revenue generator for the T. That'll be a sort of a second order effect potentially, but the primary focus of this has all been, addressing the housing supply issue.
Great, thank you, Tim. Next, we have Donna Dickerson. And then Rich, I do see your hand up. So following Donna, I'll be happy to hear you speak. So feel free to unmute yourself, Donna. And if you could introduce yourself and your address for the record.
Did you? Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I'm Donna Dickerson and I'm Pete Jackson's wife. I live at 14 Capon Street, and I really appreciate everyone's comments, and I've really learned a lot from Tim's presentations and from everything you've all said. I just want to reiterate Pete's point that we moved here because of the trolley. Without the trolley, I wouldn't live in this neighborhood and I wouldn't live in this town, because for 36 years I worked in Cambridge. I'm now retired, but I just want to speak up for the people who rely on the trolley and on connections to the trolley and to Ashmont Station to get to their jobs. And now I rely on it to get to the airport and to get to cultural events. And it's a real quality of life amenity for me. So it is, I think the trolley is absolutely essential to Milton. And I just hope that puts in,
Absolutely.
I'd like to see an end to any discussion of getting rid of the service. And like Pete, I really support the development of affordable housing, and I'm really interested in the development of multifamily housing. It's been very shocking to me. I come from the Midwest, and it's been very shocking to me that Milton has so little. I mean, I can't understand why we don't provide more units for people who are just entering the market. The children who've grown up in this town who can't afford to buy a house, for instance. So I think rental properties are really important. So this has been, I've learned a lot. I really appreciate Cheryl speaking up on behalf of expanding the area of impact, because when I hear Elliott Street corridor, it's hard for me to imagine that the full half mile from the transit line is really being considered. And I also, I'm glad to hear that half, and is it correct that half of the units can be in other areas of Milton?
Yeah, so there's two metrics that have to be kind of satisfied at the same time. And so however big the total zoning district is, half of that area has to be in the transit catchment zone of a half a mile from any of those stations, and half of it can be elsewhere in town with some other kind of restrictions on those areas. And the other metric is half of the what we call zoned capacity, which is sort of the number of potential units that could be developed under the zoning. Half of those have to be in the transit area, and then half of them can be elsewhere. So there are minimum numbers out there, but it really kind of just comes down to whatever we decide to do. Half of it's got to be in the transit area, half of it can be elsewhere.
Okay. Well, it just, it's starting to really dawn on me, the scope of this initiative, and I really support its aims, but at the same time, I just can't even imagine how the developable land will be found. In the term eminent domain looms in my consciousness. I just can't see how it can actually happen.
So I want to, and Ms. Dickerson, it sounds like you may be done, but if you're not, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but I do want to, there's no eminent domain conversation anywhere here. It's zoning. The house that you live in now has zoning underneath it. The houses on Canton Ave have zoning underneath them. 88 Wharf has zoning underneath it. The town has never been involved in any kind of, taking in any of those regards. What we're doing is sort of setting land use regulations for individual private landowners to either take advantage of or not take advantage of. One thing that DHCD and everyone at the state level has made clear is that the law is not a production mandate in the way that, for instance, 40B is in its way a production mandate. It says you've got to have 10% affordable housing, and if you don't, someone's going to come in and give it to you. What MBTA Communities is about opening up the possibility for these things to happen. If we pass zoning and not a single unit gets built, we're in the clear, because we will have done our job. We will have set the land use regulations that allow for development. And then if the market, picks it up, then it picks it up. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But, obviously we want to make zoning that kind of achieves the goals, that we set for ourselves. But at the end of the day, if no units get produced, you're not going to see, I just don't want to talk about eminent domain because it doesn't have anything to do with this. And I'm not trying to be critical of that concern. I just want to assure people that this is all about land use regulations for individual property owners to use or not use.
Well, thank you for explaining that. That's really reassuring. And I really look forward to the robust community engagement process, and I'll stay tuned, and you'll be seeing me at more of these meetings too. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. So thank you for speaking. And now, Rich, you had your hand up as well.
Yes. Yeah. No. Agreed. I thought both the folks that spoke were I agree with, and great concerns, great comments. So just a couple of comments that I have on this is that, one, I mean, I know I've said this before, and it's probably so in the weeds, and I know Tim, you kind of, I don't know if you really agreed with it or not, but like the fact of the matter is the trolley in, say, the Red Line in Quincy is not the same type of mass transit. They're very different. And I know that they might not look at it that way, but I do think we should do everything in our power when we look into this to try to even get a few percent off, just because the trolley is, again, in no way the same as the mass transit of the Red Line, the Orange Line, the Green Line, or any of the other subway systems. So that aside, though, and I'm also a huge proponent of it not being in one area. I think I've said that, every year that I've been on the planning board, I'd like to see thoughtful view of the town, and it's unfortunate that it says 50% needs to be in this one neighborhood. So it would be nice to, decrease as much as possible. But I also want to make sure that, we're careful on this type of conversation, because I know, and we've been talking about this now for a few months, and, there's talk about making sure that we look at the whole town, but then we sometimes jump to a neighborhood like East Milton, right? So anytime we start doing that, I think when we start the process, we're going to quickly go into a battle with neighborhoods, and it could destroy the entire project or the entire work that we're going to put forward. If you start talking about East Milton, right now we got a 92 unit, 40B in front of us. We got 440 Granite, and who knows what else is coming. That's going to be a tough conversation in one neighborhood. And so I will just say right off the bat to everybody on this board, there is a T-stop in every corner of this town. And I am not looking to say, hey, East Milton has got some density, near Mattapan, Blue Hill has got some density, let's put it there. I'm looking at all neighborhoods in the town as we push this forward, or I will probably be one of those folks that say we should do nothing, because this could be a good project, or it could just be a complete battle in town meeting. And so I think we got to be very thoughtful in how we do this.
I agree, Rich. Yeah.
So Rich, one thing I'll say to that, and I take those comments to heart, and I think they're totally, in bounds and valid. So you all are the politicians, and I'm the planner. And so, I mean, and this is relative to the presentation I gave at the last meeting. What I did was I presented areas that had, a planning rationale behind additional density via parcel size, via access to other forms of transit, via, history of sort of non-single family uses. Those were sort of, you can't use the term low-hanging fruit because this is all going to be very difficult, but, I identified the areas where, you could have a kind of a defensible planning rationale behind this. Now there's way beyond planning conversations here. There are, political and kind of quality of life and all sorts of other conversations that I see, I leave to all of you. But I mean, technically speaking, you could draw a 5-acre polygon around any part of town and conceivably put one of these districts in it. The question then becomes, is this wise to put multifamily housing here? And so those are sort of the trade-offs between, are we sort of identifying particular places that are unduly impacted versus, what's the point of putting multifamily in the middle of the woods somewhere? It doesn't really achieve the goals that kind of transit-oriented development is trying to do. So that's how I see my role of kind of putting out, what I consider to be, reasonable kind of planning rationales. And then I think your all jobs is to weigh all the other, quite frankly, messy stuff.
That's Cheryl, if you don't mind, I just want to follow up just to answer that. So Tim, sorry, I didn't interrupt you in that because I thought that was really good and good info, but definitely don't take that as it wasn't directed at you. You know me, I say a lot of this, I've been saying this stuff for 4 years. But I will say that just one point I will make, I agree with you, when you think about affordable housing, you got to think about where you're putting it. But in my time on the warrant committee, my time on the planning board, there are neighborhoods that are seemingly off limits in this town because why would you do that to that neighborhood? And then there are other neighborhoods that, well, of course we should put it there. And to me, it's offensive. And this is not directed at you, this is directed at just the folks that are listening at what, in my opinion, and just mine, I feel like the reason why we have such battles in this town is because we just direct things in one or certain areas. And quite honestly, if you really want to make changes to a town and start talking about density and affordable housing and really changing the way, I'm not saying that we should do this, but changing the way the neighborhoods look, well, then you're going to have to go into some of those more affluent communities and start making some changes on the planning. And I'm just kind of spiraling here for a second, but I've seen over the past year, a 9-unit condo got destroyed near an affluent community, but then really large ones go through near more dense communities. And so I might not be on the planning board when this one comes around, but I will say that I will be very vocal and to make sure that we are extremely thoughtful in this process to make sure that it's not centered around just a couple neighborhoods. Because to Sean's point, 25, this will destroy these communities. And so either the town steps up and says, this is what we are all going to take, and then seriously all going to take, or granted I'm one voter, but I would be opposed to anything to do with this type of legislation. Again, not directed at anybody. This is just my feeling.
Great. Thank you, Rich.
So,
and Cheryl, you had.
Yeah. So Rich, I'm going to ask if you might reconsider some of your language. I think we have to be careful about saying that it's going to destroy the entire town, at least at this juncture, because we're just starting. And I think it's important for us to be thoughtful, thorough in our analysis and to help and have that help us be rational about the decisions that we make. And so it may be that we end up there 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, but I think we have to be open-minded, as one of the speakers at our prior meeting asked us to be, because there could be benefit from this as well. And even the speakers tonight acknowledged that there could be some benefit. So then the next point I wanted to make.
Do you mind if I just answer you?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so yes, I actually agree with you. I agree with everything you just said. I just get very worried sometimes because, and it's probably a trigger for me when I hear certain neighborhoods, because it's too easy to say, hey, there's some density there or some density over here, so let's start there. And in my opinion, that's what happens a lot in our town is we start there. And so I am 100% open-minded, 100% on board with what you just said, as long as we truly are looking at the entire town, and not just looking at one area or two areas. I will say that on the Canton side of town, there is a lot of public transportation over there. There's a lot of people that commute right through that area. There's a lot of buses, a lot of affluent area and community too. I don't think they would appreciate if we said, hey, we're going to target your neighborhood. But quite honestly, neither does this MBTA communities where they're going to get 50%. So I'm just kind of saying, I personally want to see our town take a good look at the entire town and say, what do we want to be? What do we want to be like? I don't want to see us start closing off neighborhoods and saying, well, that's where we're going to build it. You know, and so I'm just saying, I'm agreeing with you, Cheryl. I'm just qualifying it by saying, let's make sure we're truly thoughtful on it.
Yeah, no, I agree, Rich. You know, I've advocated for some time also that we look at having multifamily and the affordable housing in particular spread out throughout the town, because the responsibility is throughout the town and the impact should be throughout the town. So I agree with you completely about that. One of the things I wanted to mention is a way to help us understand that, and a suggestion, is when we were first hit with so many of these 40Bs at the same time, I asked the GIS department, Ellen Bishop, to generate maps. And I thought they were very helpful to understand, because there is multifamily in some parts of town that people don't necessarily think about. So for example, Fuller Village, even near where I live at the corner of Canton Avenue and Blue Hills Parkway, there's Quissit Brook, and there's Home Inc. There's Winter Valley, just a little bit down the street. And so there is multifamily in these places. It's not the same kind of multifamily as a 6-story 40B, granted, but there's multifamily also on Elliott Street. And so there are things that are spread out. And I think if we had some mapping, that could be helpful too. And I can check just to see what maps that were generated for that process for the planning board before, or if there's other mapping that we I think would be helpful to us to understand, and for the residents to understand where our multifamily currently exists. That's something that can be easily produced. At that time too, I think had him map where 2 families were located. Those don't count for this, but 3 families would. And there are some 3 families in Milton, so we might want to look at some mapping of that as well. And then I think it would be useful to see some mapping of density. So if you said, okay, you know, the Residence A district has this level of density, East Milton Square has this level of density, and just so people can begin to understand when they think of the neighborhoods, what level of density already exists in those neighborhoods. So some of that is just visualization, the starting point, visualization.
That's good. And was there anyone else from the public who wanted to speak? Because we have a couple more things on our agenda we would I'd like to get to if we could, but I just want to make sure. Is there anyone else? Please feel free to raise your hand. And this will be an ongoing discussion just for the folks watching and the folks who watch this. This will be a running agenda item, and we welcome public comment. So, Tim.
Yeah. So just before we get out of this, you know, I think Cheryl kind of outlined some bullet points for kind of lines of inquiry, you know, that we want to kind of explore, you know, whether it's via consultant services or not. Please continue thinking in those terms, and send me any kind of ideas. I'm going to start to talk to some folks and kind of see what's out there. Like I said, there's some tools and some resources that are coming down from the state that may also help us. So before we actually get kind of a scope of work out on the street, yeah, I'd like to see what those are. But I think, you know, figuring out what the questions are is going to be really important. And I have a little bit of homework that I've gotten that I'll try to put together. So yeah, I think this should be a standing item, and we'll kind of, Meredith, in a week or so, we'll kind of figure out exactly kind of where we are for the next agenda.
That's great. All right, thank you so much. And so the next item I wanted to put on was just sort of a rollout and a discussion of where we are. And Tim, this is wonderful that you've gotten this. You've gotten some grants that we can utilize and not have to dip into our planning board's funds. But I did want you to talk about our budget as we go forth. We've got our RFP. We're putting out for a consultant for East Milton overlay zoning, and talking about any other grant money coming in. And one thing that we have on our list of priorities is a discussion of an ADU article, and that we were sent back to do further study. So I want us to honor what town meeting has asked us to do. I would like to see us in some capacity find funds for a consultant to work with us. The ADU was very divisive. What I think it would be to have a third party outside consultant to work with us and actually help us with some outreach to the community, and possibly doing a survey. I think would be really important. I know Needham hired a consultant. I'm not sure who they hired, but maybe if we could be thinking about that and somehow how to fund a consultant to assist us with looking at an ADU that would meet the needs of the residents of Milton.
Yeah, so I think similarly to what we just talked about, step one is figuring out what you need to know and what you want someone to help you out with. So surveying, community process. If there's any additional analysis that you think is necessary, getting those down on paper into a draft kind of scope of work, I think is step one. As it relates to the budget. The planning board, so I think there's kind of been a general kind of understanding that the board may have to chip in additional funds, for the East Milton work. We have, Josh, we have $40,000 from the state, $10,000 from MPIC, $15,000 from the South Shore Chamber of Commerce. So we've got $65,000, for that. I don't think that this project is a $100,000 project, but I think it'll probably come in at more than $65,000. Just understanding, how much we paid for the Milton Village design guidelines. If we want to have, a good design guideline process, we'll probably be, spending a little bit of money on that. But, we do have resources, from outside, the budget. So that is, there's a little bit of a wait and see on that. The only other thing that we have is, and we talked about this, I think, at the last meeting, is I've been in touch with BSC Group, which is one of the firms that, as it happens, it looks like Denny's in the audience. Denny had reached out to BSC and a couple other firms on a general land area minimum count relative to 40B. I got in touch with BSC. I said, hey, the scope is about a year old. Are you still interested in doing this project? They said, yes. They're going to get me a fresh scope with a fresh fee proposal. I think their fee proposal at the time was $8,500. I think generally we've thought like this is a, $10,000 max project. So, the way that I would think about it is, the board has $10,000 already spoken for, and then another 40 to kind of figure out, how to kind of divvy that up between, potentially chipping in some additional funds on the East Milton project and pursuing other initiatives.
Great.
I just had a question, Tim, on the open space plan. Are planning board funds needed for that?
So we got a appropriation via a supplemental budget request through the planning board, but that's a separate appropriation for that project. So we're in the clear on that.
Okay, great. Would you say that how much money would you say? I know you said we're gonna need to see. In Milton Village, we ended up engaging Beta to do a traffic and parking analysis based on a build-out analysis. I think we have a build-out analysis in the scope of work for the consultant for planning purposes. But it seems to me we might want to reserve some funds for the traffic and parking analysis. And what they did before was sort of a pre-zoning, so current condition, which we might already have data for that based on the studies that have been done. But maybe that's something to talk to Beta about or whomever. And then the build out analysis piece of it. So I think if it would be helpful if you could talk to them and see what the scope of work or what the cost might be for that scope of work. I think it would be beneficial to plan for that. And there was some service zone recommendations I think they provided before. I guess the question would be, in that build out analysis, would they factor in the service zone piece of it as well? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, so we can definitely talk to Beta about that and get a draft kind of quote. The other thing to kind of think about, about this particular project is, in a way I'm kind of thinking about in terms of the grant money, which is the kind of the biggest chunk of funding that we have. And that's for zoning. And so, at the end of that contract, we've got to produce kind of a zoning product. And so I think there's a priority there just in terms of kind of getting that component done with the scope that we, contributed. The other thing to think about though is that's, we've kind of got like an 18-month timeline on this project, which spans fiscal years. And so, one thing to think about is, thinking ahead to the next fiscal year about like, okay, we want to contribute this amount of funding in fiscal 23 at the outset of the project. And then, this amount, in fiscal 24 for kind of additional kind of stuff. So I think, again, just as I said before, figure out what questions we want answered, and then we can kind of start to kind of fit those pieces in, to use those budgetary resources. Again, we want to make sure we get the job done right, which I think everyone wants to do, but also, eventually there are other parts of town to plan. But I think, leveraging, as many resources as we can in the most kind of judicious way we can, to get that job done. So I think, we can get all those numbers together and then kind of slot them in a timeline that makes sense.
The other thing I'd like to suggest is to set aside or to plan to set aside some additional funds for the MBTA communities analysis. I appreciate the 50,000, but like you just said, we don't think it's going to be enough. And so that's such an important piece of what needs to happen, and whether some of that is, funding from this fiscal year and some of it's next fiscal year. I would, that's the other recommendation that I have.
So really very important. Okay. Anything else, Tim? And
so yeah, that's the only other thing I would say. And Meredith, if you can send me whatever kind of you liked out of Needham, and then just think about in kind of specific concrete terms what kind of questions we want answered that will kind of inform a sort of a redraft of an ADU bylaw. Right. And then we can kind of fit that into a scope and kind of figure out where to put that stuff.
Good. Okay, and I don't know if there's anything new on the zoning recodification.
Meredith, did you get any correspondence from Sue about this?
Yeah, she said everything's on track. The last I spoke with her, everything's on track. She estimates the response time from general code to be probably in January, that they'll be completed with their work.
Okay, so as we get new information on this, I mean, and that's another thing to think about, as we think about other, I think all the zoning that we've been talking about is important, but also, this is a biggie that's going to be at the annual town meeting in May or June or whenever we decide to do it. And just kind of, thinking deliberately about that timeline for other things. We try to do zoning in the fall. I think we fail at doing zoning in the fall a lot. But let's.
We need to get this done.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, and I think the town will welcome it. So, okay. With that, I think, was there anyone from the public who had any other questions?
I think Maggie's got her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Maggie?
Oh, so I don't have a question on the recodification, but I was wondering if I could, say something
Yes.
about something totally different.
Sure.
So I just wanted to say that, as you know, our town clerk, Sue Galvin, and town council, Kevin Freitag, are hosting seminars for the residents and for us elected and appointed officials. And I actually did attend Monday's presentation on the open meeting law. And so Kevin gave a great informative presentation outlining the particulars of the law, as well as providing opportunity for those of us to ask questions. So during this presentation, I learned that we, the planning board, actually participated in an incident that violated the open meeting law. We had a meeting on August 11th to discuss the RFP for East Milton. We did not have enough time to go over to go through the document line by line as a board in the public hearing. So we agreed to send Tim our comments so he could prepare a draft for our review at our next meeting on August 25th. So on August 16th, I emailed my edits and comments to Tim, and Tim replied asking me if it was okay for him to forward them to the rest of the board. And I said that I didn't have a problem if he shared my comments. And then on August 18th, Cheryl sent an email to Tim, copying the chair of the selectmen and the town administrator, commenting on my edits and the revisions. And she asked Tim to please share those comments with the other planning board members, in which Tim did. So the problem arose with the subsequent forwarding of my email with further comments caused me to consider if this email conversation was a violation of the open meeting law. And because I thought email conversation is the same as a verbal conversation, so I reached out to town council and I left a message. And then at this Monday's presentation, town council explained that all forms of communication, verbal or written, with board members do it during deliberation, needs to be made in public during the hearing to ensure that the process is transparent. Town council said to remedy the situation, the violation should be disclosed at our next meeting, which is tonight. So it's on the record. So I'm just letting the residents know that we had a discussion outside the public meeting, and if anyone is interested in getting a copy of the email exchange, they should reach out to Tim, who'll provide a copy. And so I just want to apologize to the residents for my part in this. It was not intentional. Town council indicated that there is often a desire to be efficient as possible. And so the forwarding of multiple conversations prior to a meeting is helpful, but it is actually a violation. So I'm just wondering if we could invite him to speak specifically to our process of collecting comments for discussion at meetings and how we best should accomplish this so we don't violate the open meeting law. So I just want to thank Sue Galvin for arranging these presentations, because I've found them to be valuable to new board members like myself. And, I encourage all of us to attend because they do provide a helpful reminder.
So before we talk about anything about this, and Maggie, this is, I'm glad that you brought this up. We are potentially engaging in another open meeting law violation if we continue to talk about, it's not on the agenda. So I think let's put this on an agenda for the next meeting, and then contemporaneous with that, we can ask Kevin to come in to continue to address it. So Maggie, you may have to repeat all of that, for the purposes of being above board. But then we'll also hopefully have town council in the room to provide color and guidance and advice about the rest of that. So Meredith, I don't want to like jump in and do
No. I was
or
going to
anything,
say the
but
same thing.
let's just get this on the next
Let's
agenda.
put that on an agenda, and I think it's great. And I think any of those workshops, that are being offered by town council in Sioux Galvin, they're great. Again, for people to attend. So, thank you, Maggie, for going to that.
Okay, yeah, not a problem, thanks.
And we'll put that on the agenda. And with that, I am ready for a motion to adjourn if we have one.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second,
Great. Let's see. Maggie,
yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Rich,
Yes.
Sean,
Yes.
and myself. Yes. Good evening. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Okay, good night, thanks.